When Dr. Eliza Hawthorne discovered that the most powerful duke in England had been secretly writing her love letters for 6 months, she did what no proper Victorian woman would dare. She called him a coward to his face. In a world where unmarried intellectual women were dismissed as worthless curiosities, where silence was survival and speaking truth meant ruin, Eliza had spent years translating the voices of the dead because the living refused to hear her. But the day she found red wax and cream paper in a duke's private study, everything changed. This is the story of the woman who chose honesty over safety, and the aristocrat who had to learn that love hidden behind beautiful words is still love withheld. If you're watching from London, Paris, New York, or anywhere in between, stay until the end to see how this impossible love story unfolds. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. The rain fell like cold accusations against the windows of the Royal Archive Library, each drop a reminder that London had no mercy for those who didn't belong. Dr. Eliza Hawthorne stood alone in the manuscript preservation room, her fingers carefully turning the pages of a 14th century psalter while the world outside pretended she didn't exist. She was 32 years old, unmarried, unchaperoned, unrepentant. In Victorian England, those three facts made her something worse than scandalous. They made her irrelevant. "Still playing with your dusty books, Miss Hawthorne?" The voice belonged to Edmund Pritchard, the library's senior cataloger, a man whose mediocrity was protected by the simple fact of his gender. He stood in the doorway with that familiar smirk, the one that said he knew exactly what the world thought of women like her. Eliza didn't look up from her work. "Dr. Hawthorne, I have a doctorate in medieval linguistics from Oxford. You may use my proper title, or you may leave my workspace." "Oxford doesn't grant real degrees to women," Pritchard said, stepping inside uninvited. "Everyone knows that certificate you wave around is just a courtesy, a pat on the head for trying." "Oxford granted me the same examination as every male candidate," Eliza replied, her voice sharp as a scalpel. "I scored higher than 60% of them, including, I believe, yourself, though you failed the Latin translation section 3 times before they took pity on you." Pritchard's face flushed crimson. "You arrogant—" "I believe you have cataloging work to complete in the main hall," Eliza interrupted, finally meeting his eyes. "Unless you'd prefer I mention to Director Wainwright how I discovered those missing Italian manuscripts in your personal collection last month." The silence that followed was deeply satisfying. Pritchard turned and left without another word, slamming the door behind him hard enough to make the ancient shelves shudder. Eliza released a slow breath and returned her attention to the psalter, but her hands were shaking now. They always shook after confrontations like this. Not from fear, never from fear, but from the exhausting weight of having to prove her existence every single day. She had been fighting this battle since she was 17 years old, when her father, a country vicar with progressive ideas and an excellent library, had told her something revolutionary. "Intelligence is not a masculine trait, Eliza. It is a human one. Never apologize for yours." He had died 2 years later, leaving her with nothing but books, debts, and a fierce determination to make his faith in her mean something. The other scholars at the Royal Archive treated her like an exotic creature, fascinating in theory, disturbing in practice. They would request her expertise when a particularly difficult translation defeated them, then refuse to credit her work in their published papers. They would attend her lectures on medieval French literature, then whisper that she was too sharp, too confident, too unwomanly. They needed her brilliance but resented her presence. So Eliza had learned to survive in the margins. She took on the tedious, meticulous work that prestigious scholars considered beneath them: authentication, preservation, cross-referencing, endless footnotes. She lived in a modest boarding house in Clerkenwell, where the landlady charged her double because single women are a moral risk. She wore the same 3 dresses in rotation because new clothing cost money she sent to her younger sister in Cornwall, who at least had managed to marry a kind pharmacist. And every evening, Eliza returned to her small room and read the letters. They had started arriving 6 months ago. The first one appeared on her desk at the library one morning in early spring, tucked between reference volumes on Carolingian script. Cream-colored paper, expensive quality, sealed with red wax that bore no identifying mark. She had almost thrown it away, assuming it was another anonymous insult. The library received those regularly, crude notes about blue stockings and unnatural women that someone thought were clever. But when she broke the seal, the letter inside was something entirely different. "I've been thinking about silence," it began. "Not the silence of empty rooms, but the silence of things too true to say aloud. How we fill our lives with noise, conversation, duty, the endless performance of who we're supposed to be, because silence would force us to hear what we've been avoiding." There was no signature, no greeting, no explanation, just careful, beautiful handwriting and thoughts that felt like they'd been pulled from Eliza's own chest. She had read it 7 times that first day, analyzing it the way she analyzed ancient manuscripts. The writer was educated. Classical references, precise grammar, a scholar's vocabulary. The ink was high quality, probably German. The handwriting suggested someone who wrote frequently, with an unusual forward slant that indicated either haste or emotion held carefully in check. But beyond the technical details, there was something else. The letter understood loneliness, not the shallow loneliness of social isolation, but the deeper kind. The loneliness of having thoughts no one else wanted to hear, of living in a world that had no room for what you actually were. A week later, the second letter arrived. Then a third. They came irregularly, sometimes twice in 1 week, sometimes with 2 weeks of silence between them. Each one explored a different idea. Beauty in small things, the comfort of books, the exhaustion of pretending, the quiet dignity of work that mattered even when no one noticed. The 7th letter contained a pressed violet, its purple petals carefully preserved between sheets of thin paper. The 9th letter discussed starlight and the mathematical precision of celestial motion, then ended with a single line. "Sometimes I think the stars are lonely too, burning in all that darkness, wondering if anyone sees them." Eliza kept every letter in a locked wooden box beneath her bed. She told no one about them. Not her sister, not even Mrs. Chen, the elderly Chinese manuscript specialist who was the closest thing Eliza had to a friend at the archive. The letters were hers. A secret correspondence with a ghost who somehow knew exactly what words she needed to hear. She had tried, of course, to discover the writer's identity. She'd analyzed the handwriting, compared it against documents in the library's collection, even attempted to track the letter's delivery pattern. But the anonymous writer was clever, or careful, or both. The letters appeared at different times, in different locations, never when anyone was watching. Sometimes Eliza imagined it was her father, somehow reaching across death to remind her she wasn't alone. Other times she imagined it was simply her own mind, fractured by isolation, writing letters to herself and forgetting in the morning. But the paper was real. The ink was real. The pressed flowers were real. Someone out there saw her, even if she never knew who. On the evening that changed everything, Eliza was working late in the preservation room, repairing a damaged binding on a 12th century bestiary. The library was officially closed, but Director Wainwright allowed her to work after hours, partly because her scholarship was valuable, partly because it meant he didn't have to see her during normal business hours. The gas lamps cast warm pools of light across her work table. Rain drummed steadily against the windows. Somewhere in the building, a pipe clanged and settled. Eliza was carefully applying adhesive to a separated spine when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She looked up, frowning. The night watchman didn't make rounds until 10 o'clock, and it was barely 8. The footsteps stopped outside her door. A soft knock. "The library is closed," Eliza called out, not moving from her work. "If you require assistance, please return during business hours tomorrow." The door opened anyway. A man stepped inside, and Eliza's first thought was that he looked like someone who'd been carved from winter itself, all sharp lines and cold precision. He was perhaps 35, tall, with dark hair, and the kind of face that gave away absolutely nothing. His clothing was impeccable. A perfectly tailored black coat, charcoal waistcoat, pristine white collar. Everything about him suggested wealth, power, and the absolute certainty that doors opened when he knocked. "Dr. Hawthorne," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, and somehow familiar in a way that made Eliza's pulse quicken. She set down her adhesive brush with deliberate care. "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage, sir. You know my name, but I don't know yours." "Adrian Vale," he said. "Duke of Norbridge." The air seemed to leave the room. Everyone in England knew the Duke of Norbridge's reputation. Wealthy beyond imagination, politically powerful, and intensely private. His family's estate controlled half of Yorkshire and significant portions of Lancashire. He sat in the House of Lords but rarely spoke. He attended precisely 3 social events per season and left early from all of them. There were rumors, of course. There were always rumors about powerful men who kept to themselves. Some said he was a tyrant who ruled his household with cruelty. Others claimed he was grieving a lost love and had sworn off society forever. The scandal sheets called him the Ice Duke and speculated endlessly about why such a wealthy, titled bachelor remained unmarried. Eliza had never paid attention to any of it. The problems of aristocrats meant nothing to a woman fighting for the right to exist in her own profession. But now the Ice Duke was standing in her preservation room at 8 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday, looking at her with eyes the color of smoke. "How may I assist you, Your Grace?" Eliza asked, keeping her voice professionally neutral. Adrian Vale moved further into the room, his gaze sweeping across the shelves of manuscripts, the careful organization of her tools, the bestiary open on her work table. When he looked at her workspace, something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but recognition. "I have acquired a manuscript," he said. "Medieval, possibly 13th century. It requires authentication and translation." "The British Museum has an excellent medieval studies department," Eliza replied. "I'm certain they would be delighted to assist a patron of your standing." "I don't want the British Museum." His eyes met hers. "I want you." The statement hung in the air between them, strange and weighted. Eliza forced herself to breathe normally. "May I ask why?" "Because 3 years ago you published a paper in the Journal of Medieval Studies identifying a previously unknown correspondence between Eleanor of Aquitaine and Bernard of Clairvaux. You proved that 6 letters in the Bibliothèque Nationale had been misdated by 40 years and misattributed to the wrong Bernard entirely. Your work was brilliant, meticulous, and it eviscerated the leading theory of a scholar who had built his entire career on being right." Eliza remembered that paper. She remembered the aftermath, too, the senior professor who'd accused her of ambitious overreach, the committee that had tried to block publication, the whispers that she was difficult and aggressive. She had been right, though. The evidence had been irrefutable. "That paper made me quite unpopular in certain academic circles," she said carefully. "That paper made you the best medieval manuscript specialist in England," Adrian replied, "which is why I need your expertise." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded letter, not the manuscript he'd mentioned, but a modern piece of correspondence. He held it out to her. Eliza took it, noting the weight of the paper, the quality of the ink. It was from Professor Wilhelm Hartmann in Munich, one of the most respected manuscript experts in Europe. The letter was brief and direct. "If you have acquired a medieval document of questionable provenance, there is only one scholar in London whose authentication I would trust without reservation. Dr. Eliza Hawthorne at the Royal Archive Library. She is difficult, she is expensive, and she is never wrong." Eliza looked up from the letter, something like satisfaction warming her chest. "Professor Hartmann is very kind." "Professor Hartmann is very German," Adrian said, "which means he doesn't waste words on kindness. If he says you're the best, you're the best." "And if I agree to examine your manuscript?" Eliza asked. "What are your terms?" "You would work at Norbridge House. I have a private library that contains approximately 4,000 volumes, including a substantial collection of medieval manuscripts my grandfather acquired but never properly catalogued. You would have full access to whatever resources you require. The compensation would be £50. Eliza nearly dropped the letter. £50 was more than she earned in 6 months at the Royal Archive. £50 could pay her sister's medical bills from the difficult birth last winter. £50 could buy her a new dress, new shoes, books of her own instead of borrowed ones. A month where she didn't have to choose between heating her room and eating dinner. But nothing came without cost, especially not from powerful men. "Why so generous?" she asked bluntly. Adrian's expression didn't change. "Because I'm told you're worth it. Because the manuscript is potentially valuable, and I don't trust inferior scholarship. And because I suspect you're accustomed to being underpaid for your expertise." That last part was so precisely, infuriatingly accurate that Eliza almost smiled. "I would require certain conditions," she said. Name them. I work alone. I will not tolerate interruptions, supervision, or unsolicited opinions about my methods. If I determine the manuscript is fraudulent, I will say so regardless of how much you paid for it, and I will not falsify my findings to protect anyone's investment or reputation. Agreed. I'm serious, Your Grace. I've had collectors pressure me to authenticate forgeries because they didn't want to admit they'd been deceived. I've been offered bribes to— Dr. Hawthorne, Adrian's voice cut through her warning with quiet certainty. I am hiring you precisely because you cannot be bribed, pressured, or deceived. Your integrity is not a liability. It's the entire point. Eliza studied him carefully. He stood perfectly still, his posture precise, his face unreadable. Everything about him suggested control, the kind of rigid self-discipline that came from years of practice. She knew that kind of control. She lived it every day. When would you require me to begin? She asked. Tomorrow. I'll send a carriage to collect you at 9 o'clock. Bring whatever tools and references you need. I haven't agreed yet. No, Adrian said, but you will. It wasn't arrogance in his voice, just certainty, the quiet knowledge of someone who understood exactly what she needed and what she would choose. He was right, of course. £50 was impossible to refuse, but Eliza made him wait anyway, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, establishing that whatever this arrangement was, she would not be easily managed. Very well, she said finally. 9 o'clock tomorrow. But I make no promises about timeline. Medieval authentication cannot be rushed. I wouldn't want you to rush, Adrian replied. He turned to leave, then paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Your work matters, Dr. Hawthorne, he said quietly, even when people pretend it doesn't. Don't forget that. Then he was gone, leaving only the sound of rain and the faint scent of expensive cologne. Eliza stood frozen in the preservation room, her heart beating strangely fast. She returned to her work table and tried to focus on the bestiary binding, but her hands wouldn't cooperate. Something about the encounter felt significant in ways she couldn't articulate. Your work matters. No one had said that to her in 3 years, not since her father died. She packed up her tools early and walked home through the rain, her mind spinning through possibilities and dangers. Working for a duke meant entering a world that had no place for women like her. She would be a curiosity, a useful tool, nothing more. But £50 meant freedom. Even temporary freedom was worth something. When she reached her boarding house, soaked and shivering, Mrs. Patterson, the landlady, handed her a letter with a disapproving sniff. More of your strange correspondence, the woman said. I don't know what kind of gentleman sends unsealed letters to unmarried women, but it's not proper. Eliza took the letter without responding and climbed the stairs to her room. She knew what it was before she opened it. Cream-colored paper, red wax seal. The 11th letter from her anonymous writer. She broke the seal with trembling fingers, unfolded the paper, and read, I have been thinking about courage. Not the kind celebrated in stories, the soldier's charge, the explorer's journey, but the quieter kind. The courage of continuing when the world tells you to stop. The courage of speaking truth when silence would be safer. The courage of existing as yourself when everyone else demands you become smaller, softer, less. You possess that courage. I see it in everything you do, even when you don't see it yourself. Don't lose it. The world needs voices like yours, even when it pretends otherwise. No signature, no explanation, just words that reached inside her chest and held her heart gently. Eliza read the letter 3 times, then carefully placed it in the wooden box with the others. She changed into her nightgown, wrapped herself in a threadbare blanket, and sat by her window looking out at the rain-soaked streets of London. Tomorrow she would enter a duke's private library. Tomorrow she would step into a world that had always excluded her. But tonight she had a letter from someone who saw her courage when the rest of the world saw only defiance, and somehow that made tomorrow feel possible. The carriage that arrived at 9 o'clock the next morning was exactly as intimidating as Eliza had expected. Glossy black lacquer, a coat of arms on the door, and a driver who looked at her boarding house like it might contaminate his perfectly polished boots. Mrs. Patterson watched from the doorway with barely concealed disapproval as Eliza carried her case of tools and references to the waiting vehicle. A duke's carriage, the landlady muttered. I hope you know what you're doing, Miss Hawthorne. Respectable women don't go visiting bachelor households alone. Dr. Hawthorne, Eliza corrected automatically. And I'm working, not visiting. There's a significant difference. The world won't see it that way. Eliza climbed into the carriage without responding because Mrs. Patterson was right. The world would see exactly what it wanted to see, a desperate spinster throwing herself at aristocratic attention. Let them see it. She had stopped caring about the world's opinion around the same time the world had made clear it would never approve of her anyway. The carriage rolled through London's morning chaos, vendors shouting, children running between carts, the endless noise of a city that never stopped moving. Eliza watched it all through the window, her mind already cataloging questions about the manuscript she was about to examine. Norbridge House occupied an entire block in Mayfair, which meant Adrian Vale wasn't just wealthy. He was generationally, absurdly, world-shapingly rich. The building was Georgian perfection, pale stone, perfect symmetry, windows that reflected the morning light like cold mirrors. The butler who answered the door was elderly, professional, and utterly unsurprised by her arrival. "Dr. Hawthorne," he said with a small bow, "His Grace is expecting you. I am Blackwood. If you require anything during your time here, you need only ask." "Thank you, Blackwood." He led her through a series of corridors that felt more like a museum than a home. Marble floors, paintings by artists Eliza recognized from her art history studies, furniture that belonged in Versailles. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and completely impersonal. No photographs, no personal touches, nothing that suggested an actual human being lived here. They stopped at a set of double doors carved with an intricate design of vines and books. "The library," Blackwood announced, pushing the doors open. Eliza stepped inside and forgot to breathe. The room was 3 stories tall, with galleries circling the upper levels and a domed skylight that flooded everything with natural light. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with books, thousands of them, tens of thousands, arranged with obvious care. The air smelled of leather, paper, and that particular dusty sweetness that came from centuries of accumulated knowledge. It was the most beautiful room Eliza had ever seen. "I thought you might approve." Adrian's voice came from somewhere above her. She looked up and found him standing on the second-level gallery, watching her with that same unreadable expression from the night before. "This is—" Eliza struggled to find words adequate to the moment. "This is extraordinary." "My grandfather built it," Adrian said, descending the spiral staircase with the same controlled precision he seemed to apply to everything. "He believed that a man's library revealed his soul. I suspect he would be pleased to know his collection is finally being properly appreciated." He reached the main floor and gestured to a large oak table near the windows. A leather portfolio rested on its surface. "The manuscript," he said simply. Eliza approached the table, setting down her tool case with careful reverence. She opened the portfolio and drew in a sharp breath. The manuscript was a collection of letters, perhaps 20 pages, written on vellum in a clear medieval hand. The Latin was elegant, classical, the kind of educated script that indicated monastic training, but it was the content that made her heart race. Letters between a monk and a woman. Intimate, philosophical, careful. Love hidden inside scholarship. "Where did you acquire this?" Eliza asked, already pulling out her magnifying glass to examine the vellum's texture. "An estate sale in Northumberland," Adrian replied. The family claimed it had been in their possession since the 14th century, but they had no documentation to support that. Eliza studied the first letter carefully, noting the ink composition, the script style, the way certain letters were formed. Medieval documents were like fingerprints. Every scriptorium, every region, every decade had distinctive characteristics. "The hand is definitely 13th century," she murmured, more to herself than to Adrian. "Possibly Cistercian, given the script style. The Latin grammar is classical, which suggests education at a major monastery, probably France, possibly England." She looked up to find Adrian watching her with an intensity that made her suddenly uncomfortably aware of how close he was standing. "I'll need several days to complete a proper authentication," she said, refocusing on the manuscript. "Perhaps a week. I'll need access to comparative documents, reference materials on medieval monasteries, and ideally samples of authenticated Cistercian correspondence from the same period. I have a reference collection on the third level, Adrian said. Approximately 200 medieval documents my grandfather acquired. Most have never been properly examined. May I see them? He led her to the spiral staircase, and as they climbed, Eliza became acutely aware of the absolute silence of the house. No servants bustling about, no social visitors, no sound at all except their footsteps on the iron stairs. The third level was smaller, more intimate, a scholar's retreat tucked beneath the dome. The shelves here contained older, rarer volumes, and at the back of the room, a locked cabinet held the manuscript collection. Adrian produced a key and opened it. Eliza's hands trembled as she examined the contents. 13th century French poetry, a fragment of a Carolingian gospel. Letters from abbots, bishops, minor nobility. Everything carefully preserved, organized by century and region. Your grandfather had exquisite taste, she said. He had money and an obsession, Adrian replied. The taste was mostly luck. Eliza pulled out several reference documents and carried them to a reading desk positioned beneath a window. Natural light was crucial for this kind of work. She opened the first comparison piece and immediately lost herself in analysis. The hours passed in silence. Adrian didn't interrupt, didn't hover, didn't offer unsolicited opinions or demand updates. He simply sat in a chair across the room, reading what appeared to be a state correspondence, and left her to work. It was deeply, unexpectedly peaceful. Eliza had spent years fighting for workspace, defending her right to work uninterrupted, arguing with male colleagues who thought her methods needed their improvement. She had learned to work in hostile environments, to maintain focus while being actively undermined. But this was different. Adrian's silence wasn't dismissive, it was respectful. He understood that scholarship required concentration, that some work demanded solitude. When Blackwood arrived at noon with tea and sandwiches, Eliza barely noticed. When the afternoon light shifted and the dome filled with golden warmth, she was comparing ink compositions and didn't look up. It wasn't until Adrian spoke that she realized how much time had passed. Dr. Hawthorne, it's nearly 6 o'clock. Eliza blinked, looking up from the manuscript she'd been examining. The library had grown dim around her, the last of the daylight fading. I should have brought candles, she said automatically. I have gas lamps, Adrian replied, already moving to light them. But perhaps you should stop for the day. You've been working for 9 hours without interruption. I was making progress. You'll make more progress tomorrow if you rest tonight. Eliza wanted to argue, but her eyes were burning and her back ached from hunching over the reading desk. She carefully closed the manuscript she'd been examining and stood, wincing as her muscles protested. I should return to my lodgings, she said. The carriage will take you. Adrian moved to the manuscript cabinet and locked it again. Same time tomorrow? Yes, if that's acceptable. He turned to look at her, and for the first time all day something shifted in his carefully controlled expression. Not a smile. Adrian Vale didn't seem like someone who smiled easily, but a softening. Recognition. Thank you, he said quietly, for treating these documents with care. Most scholars are so eager to prove their theories that they handle rare manuscripts like common newspapers. You understand what they are. They're voices from the past, Eliza replied. The only way some people can still speak across the centuries. They deserve respect. Something in Adrian's eyes changed when she said that. A flash of recognition so intense it made Eliza's breath catch. But before she could analyze it, he turned away, already descending the staircase. Blackwood will see you out, he said over his shoulder. 9 o'clock tomorrow. Eliza gathered her tools and followed him down, her mind spinning with questions that had nothing to do with medieval manuscripts. The carriage ride home passed in a blur. When she reached her boarding house, the 12th letter was waiting. She carried it to her room, broke the seal, and read, I have been thinking about recognition. How rare it is to meet someone who sees the world the way you do, who understands without explanation why certain things matter, who respects the silence that work requires. Most people demand performance, conversation, entertainment, the exhausting theater of social interaction. But some people understand that the deepest respect is simply bearing witness, being present without intrusion. I wonder if you've ever felt that recognition. I wonder if anyone has ever offered you that kind of silence. Eliza set the letter down with shaking hands. Today, Adrian Vale had offered her exactly that. 9 hours of respectful silence, perfect working conditions, no interruptions, no demands, no performance required. She looked at the letter again, studying the handwriting with new attention. The forward slant, the precise formation of each letter, the careful, controlled script of someone who thought deeply before writing. And suddenly, impossibly, she noticed something she should have seen months ago. The curved E, the angled cross on the T, the same formation she'd seen that very afternoon in Adrian Vale's estate correspondence. Her heart stopped. No, it couldn't be. She pulled out the wooden box from beneath her bed and spread all 11 previous letters across her narrow mattress. Then she pulled out her notebook from today's work, the notes she'd taken while comparing manuscripts, including a sample of Adrian's handwriting from his letter commissioning her services. The comparison was unmistakable. The Duke had written every single letter, 6 months of anonymous correspondence, 6 months of beautiful, vulnerable words about loneliness and courage and recognition, all from the Ice Duke, the man who stood 3 feet away from her today and said nothing, revealed nothing, admitted nothing. Eliza sat in her darkening room surrounded by cream-colored paper and red wax seals and laughed. It was not a happy sound, because she understood now. The generous payment, the respectful silence, the perfect working conditions. Adrian Vale hadn't hired her for authentication. He'd hired her because he'd been writing to her for 6 months and was too much of a coward to sign his name. And tomorrow she would have to walk back into his library knowing exactly who her anonymous correspondent was, while he continued to hide behind silence. The rain started again, steady and cold against her window. Eliza carefully returned the letters to their box and locked it. Tomorrow would be very interesting indeed. Eliza returned to Norbridge House the next morning, armed with knowledge that felt like a weapon she hadn't asked to carry. She knew the truth now. Every beautiful word, every vulnerable confession, every pressed flower had come from the man who would greet her with cold formality and pretend he'd never touched pen to paper for any purpose beyond estate business. The question was what to do with that knowledge. Confronting him directly seemed like strategic suicide. Adrian Vale was a duke, a man who controlled thousands of lives and vast portions of England's wealth. She was a woman scholar who existed only in the margins of society, tolerated but never truly accepted. If she accused him and he denied it, and of course he would deny it, she would be dismissed as delusional, desperate, or worse. But staying silent felt impossible. The carriage rolled through Mayfair's pristine streets, and Eliza pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching London's wealthy move through their morning routines. Ladies in expensive silks stepping into shops, gentlemen on horseback discussing politics and hunting, a world that had never had room for her and never would. When Blackwood opened Norbridge House's massive door, his professional courtesy was exactly the same as yesterday. Dr. Hawthorne, His Grace is in the library. Of course he was. Eliza climbed the now familiar staircase to the 3rd level, her tool case heavy in her hand. Adrian stood at the reading desk where she'd worked yesterday, arranging reference materials with precise care. He looked up as she entered, and for one unguarded second, something flickered across his face. Relief, maybe, or anticipation, before the mask of aristocratic indifference settled back into place. "Good morning, Dr. Hawthorne," he said. "I've pulled additional comparative documents that might be useful. 13th century Cistercian correspondence from Fountains Abbey." "Thank you, Your Grace." Eliza set down her case and moved to the desk, hyper-aware of every movement he made. Yesterday, his silence had seemed respectful. Today it felt like a calculated performance, every gesture rehearsed to maintain perfect distance. She opened the manuscript portfolio and forced herself to focus on the work. The monk's letters were written in careful Latin, each sentence precisely constructed. As she translated, a story emerged, a cloistered scholar writing to a woman he'd met once, years ago before taking his vows. The letters never named her, never made explicit declarations, but the longing was unmistakable. "I think of you when I copy the Psalms," one letter read. "The work requires such careful attention, such patience, and I find myself wondering if you apply that same care to whatever occupies your days." I imagine your hands moving with precision, your mind focused on details others overlook. Eliza's breath caught. Those words could have come directly from her anonymous letters. She glanced up to find Adrian watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No," Eliza lied. "I'm simply noting the unusual intimacy of the correspondence. It's rare to find medieval letters that reveal this much personal feeling." "Perhaps the writer felt safe in correspondence," Adrian said quietly. "Safer than in direct conversation." The air between them felt suddenly charged, dangerous. Eliza looked back down at the manuscript. Perhaps he was a coward who preferred beautiful words to honest ones. Silence. When she risked another glance, Adrian had turned away, his shoulders rigid. The morning passed in tense quiet. Eliza worked methodically through the authentication process, examining vellum composition, comparing script styles, cross-referencing historical records of Fountains Abbey. The manuscript was genuine, she was increasingly certain, and valuable beyond measure. But she couldn't stop reading the actual content. The monk wrote about silence and duty, about choosing a cloistered life because the world outside was too loud, too demanding, too full of expectations he couldn't meet. He wrote about finding comfort in books and manuscripts, in work that mattered even when no one noticed. He wrote about loneliness in ways that made Eliza's chest ache. "I wonder sometimes if I chose this life or if it chose me," one letter read. Whether silence is a calling or simply the path of least resistance for those who fear being truly known. At noon, Blackwood arrived with lunch, soup, bread, cheese arranged on fine china. Adrian stood from where he'd been working at his own desk. "We should eat." "I prefer to work through meals," Eliza said automatically. "Your eyes have been straining over that manuscript for 3 hours without break," Adrian replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The work will still be here in 30 minutes. He was right, annoyingly. Her vision had started to blur. They sat at a small table near the windows, London spread out below them like a map of everything they weren't allowed to discuss. The soup was excellent. The silence was excruciating. "May I ask you something, Dr. Hawthorne?" Adrian said finally. "Of course." "Do you enjoy your work at the Royal Archive?" It was such a careful, neutral question, exactly the kind of polite inquiry that revealed nothing and risked nothing. Eliza set down her spoon. "I enjoy the manuscripts, the scholarship, the feeling of giving voice to people who've been silent for centuries. But not the people you work with." "The people I work with tolerate my presence because they occasionally need my expertise," Eliza said bluntly. "They don't enjoy having me there any more than I enjoy fighting for basic respect every single day." Adrian's jaw tightened. "That seems exhausting." "It is." "Why continue then? Surely there are other ways to apply your talents." Eliza laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "Such as?" "Teaching positions are closed to women. University departments won't hire us. Publishing houses won't print our research under our own names. The Royal Archive is the only institution in England that employs female scholars at all, and they only do it because Director Wainwright's mother threatened to cut off his inheritance if he didn't." "I didn't know that." "Most people don't. They simply see unmarried women working in inappropriate fields and assume we're there because we failed at everything else." Eliza met his eyes directly. "But I didn't fail at anything, Your Grace. I simply refused to pretend I was less intelligent than I am." Something shifted in Adrian's expression, recognition, maybe, or respect. "That takes remarkable courage," he said quietly, "or remarkable stubbornness. People seem divided on which." "They're the same thing, I think. Courage is just stubbornness with better publicity." Eliza almost smiled. "Did you read that somewhere, or is that original philosophy?" "Original, I'm afraid. My formal education was mostly about estate management and Latin declensions." "You read Latin?" Eliza asked, surprised. "Passably. My tutor insisted classical education built character." Adrian paused, then added carefully, "I find it useful for reading medieval manuscripts." The statement hung between them, weighted with meaning. Eliza looked down at her soup. "How convenient!" They finished lunch in silence, but it was different now, charged with things neither of them would say. When Eliza returned to the manuscript, she found herself reading the monk's words with new understanding. This wasn't just historical correspondence. It was a mirror. A man who hid behind silence. A woman he wrote to in secret. Love expressed through careful language because direct honesty felt impossible. The parallels were almost painful. By late afternoon, Eliza had completed enough analysis to form preliminary conclusions. The manuscript was authentic, probably dated between 1240 and 1260, originating from Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire. The monk's identity was unclear, but his education suggested someone of significant standing within the monastic community. The woman he wrote to remained a complete mystery. "I have some initial findings," Eliza said, looking up from her work. Adrian crossed the room immediately, his attention absolute. "The manuscript is genuine," Eliza continued. "The vellum composition matches documented 13th century production from northern England. The script style is consistent with Cistercian practice. The Latin grammar and vocabulary are period accurate." "What about the content?" "The letters themselves are extraordinary. They document a romantic correspondence between a monk and a woman he knew before entering monastic life. The relationship was never physically consummated, he makes that clear, but the emotional attachment is unmistakable." "Why would he keep writing to her after taking vows?" Adrian asked. "Perhaps because silence felt like a different kind of betrayal," Eliza said, watching his reaction carefully. "Perhaps he believed that honest words written in private were less sinful than dishonest silence maintained in public." Adrian's expression didn't change, but his hands clenched slightly at his sides. "Or perhaps," Eliza continued, "he was simply a coward who preferred the safety of anonymous correspondence to the risk of honest conversation." "You keep using that word," Adrian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Coward. Because it fits. A man who claims to care about someone but won't admit it to their face is definitionally a coward, regardless of how beautiful his written words might be." The tension in the room could have shattered glass. "You don't know what you're talking about," Adrian said. "Don't I?" Eliza stood, gathering her courage like armor. "A man writes letters full of vulnerability and feeling. He shares his deepest thoughts, his loneliness, his recognition of someone he admires. But he never signs his name, never claims his words, never takes responsibility for the connection he's creating." "Perhaps he has reasons." "Everyone has reasons," Eliza interrupted. "The question is whether those reasons justify the cowardice." Adrian moved closer, and for the first time since she'd met him, emotion cracked through his careful control. "You think it's simple. You think honesty is just a matter of choosing to speak. I think hiding behind anonymous letters while pretending indifference in person is cruel. And I think you don't understand what it costs some people to speak honestly." They stood 2 feet apart, years of respective isolation pouring into the space between them. "Then explain it to me," Eliza said, her voice shaking. "Tell me why a man would write beautiful words about courage and recognition and then refuse to acknowledge them when standing face to face with the woman he wrote them for." Adrian went absolutely still. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice was wrong, too controlled, too careful. Eliza pulled one of the anonymous letters from her case, the one that had arrived yesterday. She held it up next to the estate correspondence she'd examined while working. "The handwriting matches," she said quietly. "The curved E, the angled cross on the T, the forward slant. I'm a manuscript expert, Your Grace. I examine handwriting for a living. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" The color drained from Adrian's face. "You've been writing to me for 6 months," Eliza continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Every letter about loneliness and courage and recognition, about understanding silence, about being seen." "Dr. Hawthorne, don't." She cut him off sharply. "Don't insult my intelligence by denying it. I have 11 letters in your handwriting discussing things we've never spoken about in person. I have pressed flowers and thoughtful reflections and—" Her voice cracked. "And I need you to tell me the truth." Adrian stood frozen, his carefully constructed defenses crumbling. Then he turned away, walking to the windows, his back to her. "You weren't supposed to know," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Why not?" "Because this—" He gestured vaguely at the library, the manuscripts, the impossible distance between them. "Because I'm the Duke of Norbridge and you're an unmarried scholar, and society has very clear rules about what's permitted between people like us." So you hired me to work in your library, Eliza said. Brought me into your home every day, gave me access to your private collection, all while pretending you hadn't been writing me love letters for half a year? They weren't love letters. Then what were they? Adrian turned back to face her, and for the first time she saw real emotion in his eyes. Fear, longing, desperation. They were the only honest thing I've done in 10 years, he said. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and terrible. Why couldn't you just tell me? Eliza asked. Why the performance? Why hire me to authenticate manuscripts when you could have simply— Because I'm a coward, Adrian interrupted, his voice harsh with self-loathing. Because I've spent a decade hiding behind duty and propriety and careful distance. Because the last time I was honest about what I felt, it destroyed my family. Eliza went very still. What happened? Adrian moved to one of the leather chairs and sat down heavily, his perfect posture finally collapsing. I was engaged once, he said quietly, to a woman named Caroline Ashford. We were young. I was 23. She was 21. Our families arranged it, but we actually cared for each other. She was intelligent, funny, kind. He paused, staring at his hands. We wrote letters to each other during our engagement. Private letters. Caroline wrote about her doubts about marriage, her frustration with society's expectations, her dreams of studying medicine. Things women weren't supposed to think, let alone say. What happened to the letters? Eliza asked, though she already knew the answer would be terrible. Caroline's sister found them, Adrian said. She was engaged to a man she actually loved, a young lawyer without title or fortune, but their parents forbade it because he wasn't wealthy enough. So the sister took Caroline's letters and showed them to her parents as evidence that our family was unsuitable. The letters were made public. Not fully public, but they were shared with enough people in our social circle to destroy Caroline's reputation. She was called unwomanly, improper, mentally unstable. The engagement was broken. Caroline's family sent her to live with distant relatives in Scotland. She died there 2 years later. Fever, they said, but you think it was something else, Eliza finished quietly. I know it was something else. Caroline wrote me one final letter before she died. She said the isolation was unbearable, that being silenced after finally finding her voice was worse than death. Adrian looked up, his eyes haunted. So yes, I'm a coward, because I learned that honest words can be weaponized, that private feelings made public can destroy people, that silence is the only way to survive in a world that punishes vulnerability. Eliza felt her anger draining away, replaced by something more complicated: understanding, pity, frustration. So you wrote anonymous letters instead, she said. I told myself it was safer, Adrian admitted. For both of us. You could receive honest words without the danger of anyone knowing their source. I could be truthful without risking another person's reputation. But that's not honesty, Eliza said. That's just a more elaborate form of hiding. I know. And bringing me here? Hiring me to work in your library? Selfishness, Adrian said bluntly. Pure selfishness. I wanted to be near you. I wanted to see if the woman I'd been writing to was as remarkable in person as she seemed from a distance. And am I? He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You're more remarkable than I imagined, he said quietly, which makes this whole situation significantly worse. Eliza sat down in the chair across from him, her mind spinning. She understood his fear now, understood why he'd hidden behind anonymity. The world had taught him that honesty meant destruction, that vulnerability was a weapon others would use against you. She'd learned similar lessons, just from different teachers, but understanding didn't mean acceptance. I need time, Eliza said finally, to think about this, to decide what I want to do with the knowledge. Are you going to leave? Adrian asked, and there was real fear in his voice. I haven't decided yet. The manuscript authentication, I'll finish the authentication, Eliza interrupted. I gave my word, and I keep my promises. But beyond that, she stood, gathering her tools. Beyond that, I don't know. Adrian stood as well, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the beautiful library that had become a battlefield of unspoken things. For what it's worth, Adrian said quietly, every word I wrote was true. Every observation, every moment of recognition, every— I know, Eliza said. That's what makes it complicated. She left Norbridge House that afternoon feeling like she'd survived a small war. The carriage ride home passed in a blur. When she reached her boarding house, Mrs. Patterson handed her another letter with her usual disapproving sniff. Eliza carried it to her room, knowing before she opened it what she would find. Cream paper, red wax. She broke the seal. I know you've discovered the truth, the letter began. I saw it in your eyes today, in the way you looked at me with disappointment and understanding in equal measure. I have no excuse for my cowardice beyond the simple fact that I am afraid of what honesty costs, afraid of destroying something beautiful by exposing it to a world that ruins beautiful things. But I realize now that hiding was its own kind of destruction, that anonymous words, no matter how true, are still a form of lying. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be the kind of man who speaks honestly without the protection of anonymity. All I know is that you deserve better than a coward who hides behind beautiful words. Forgive me. It was signed, for the first time in 6 months, with his actual name, Adrian Vale. Eliza read the letter 3 times, then carefully placed it with the others in the wooden box. Then she did something she'd never done before. She wrote back. Her letter was brief, written in the same careful script she used for academic correspondence. Your Grace, you say you're a coward, and perhaps you are, but cowardice can be overcome. The question is whether you want to overcome it or whether you prefer the safety of perpetual hiding. The monk in your manuscript wrote to his beloved for years before the correspondence ended. The final letter in the collection is torn off mid-sentence, as if he simply stopped writing one day. I wonder what happened to make him stop. I wonder if he regretted the silence more than he'd feared the honesty. Tomorrow I will return to complete the authentication. We will speak only of manuscripts and scholarship, as is proper. But after the work is finished, you will make a choice. Continue hiding behind letters and distance and careful propriety, or find the courage to speak honestly, consequences be damned. I have spent my entire life being punished for honesty. I refuse to accept a relationship, any kind of relationship, built on anonymity and fear. Dr. Eliza Hawthorne. She sealed it with her own plain wax and addressed it to Norbridge House. The next morning, when Blackwood opened the door, he handed her a note before she could even remove her coat. From His Grace, the butler said, his professional mask perfectly in place. Eliza opened it. One line in Adrian's handwriting. I choose honesty, even if it destroys me. She looked up to find Adrian standing at the top of the main staircase, watching her with an expression that held no masks, no careful distance, just fear and hope in equal measure. Shall we discuss manuscripts, Dr. Hawthorne? He asked. Not yet, Eliza replied, climbing the stairs to meet him. First, you're going to tell me the truth about why you really hired me. All of it. No beautiful metaphors, no hiding behind academic language. They stood on the landing, society's rules crumbling around them like ancient paper. I hired you because I've been in love with you since I attended your lecture on Eleanor of Aquitaine 3 years ago, Adrian said, his voice shaking but steady. Because watching you defend your scholarship against those pompous fools who tried to discredit you was the bravest thing I'd ever seen. Because you spoke truth without apology, and I needed to know what that kind of courage felt like. Why didn't you introduce yourself then? Because I'm the Duke of Norbridge, and you were a scholar being actively persecuted for your work. My attention would have made your life worse, not better. So you wrote letters instead. So I wrote letters instead. Cowardly, anonymous letters where I could be honest without causing you further harm. Eliza studied him carefully. This powerful man who'd hidden vulnerability behind aristocratic distance. The manuscript, she said finally. The monk's letters. Did you acquire them because they reflected your own situation? Adrian's expression shifted to something like shame. I acquired them because reading about someone else's cowardice made mine feel less pathetic. And now? Now I'm standing in front of you without any protection except the truth, which is that I admire you, that I think your work matters, that watching you translate those letters yesterday made me realize how much I've wasted hiding when I could have been learning from your courage instead. Eliza felt something crack open in her chest, Not the walls she'd built for protection, but something deeper. The lonely place where she'd kept all her secret hopes about what connection might feel like if someone truly saw her. "This won't be easy," she warned. "The world will call me opportunistic. They'll say I seduced you for your wealth and status." "Let them say it. Your social circle will ostracize you for marrying beneath your station. I barely speak to my social circle anyway. I won't give up my work. I won't become a decorative duchess who hosts parties and pretends to be less intelligent than she is." "I would never ask you to," Adrian said fiercely. "Your work is part of who you are. I fell in love with a brilliant scholar, not a society ornament." They stood in the elegant entrance hall, surrounded by marble and money and everything that was supposed to keep people like them separate. "I need you to understand something," Eliza said quietly. "I've fought too hard to survive in a world that wants me silent. I won't trade one kind of silence for another. If we do this, whatever this becomes, it has to be built on absolute honesty. No more anonymous letters, no more hiding." "I understand." "Do you? Because the first time you retreat into aristocratic distance instead of telling me the truth, I'm gone. I'd rather be alone than be with someone who loves me but won't admit it." Adrian took her hand, the first time he'd touched her, and his fingers were shaking. "I, Adrian Vale, Duke of Norbridge, am in love with you, Dr. Eliza Hawthorne," he said, his voice carrying through the marble hall. "I have been for 3 years. I want to know everything about you. I want to argue about medieval manuscripts and watch you work in comfortable silence and listen to you eviscerate pompous scholars who underestimate you." "That's a start," Eliza said. Then she kissed him. It was not a gentle, proper kiss. It was 3 years of loneliness and 6 months of beautiful letters and a lifetime of refusing to be smaller than she was, all condensed into one moment of absolute honesty. When they finally broke apart, Adrian was staring at her with wonder. "That," he said, "was significantly better than any letter I've ever written." "Obviously," Eliza replied, "because it was real." Somewhere in the house, Blackwood was probably having a quiet heart attack about propriety. Eliza didn't care. She'd spent her entire life being punished for existing as herself. She'd been mocked, dismissed, underpaid, and excluded from the world she'd earned the right to inhabit. But she'd survived. And now, standing in a Duke's entrance hall with her reputation about to be thoroughly destroyed, she felt more alive than she had in years. "We should probably discuss the manuscript authentication," Adrian said, though he hadn't let go of her hand. "Probably," Eliza agreed. Neither of them moved. Outside, London continued its endless noise, carriages rattling past, vendors calling their wares, the machinery of empire grinding forward without pause. But inside Norbridge House, in the space between what was expected and what was true, 2 people who'd spent years hiding finally chose to be seen. The illusion of privacy lasted exactly 3 days. 3 days of Eliza working in Adrian's library while London remained blissfully unaware that the Ice Duke had fallen in love with an unmarried scholar. 3 days of stolen conversations over manuscript translations, of Adrian's careful questions about her childhood and her work, of Eliza discovering that beneath his aristocratic reserve was a man who'd been starving for honest connection as desperately as she had. 3 days before the world noticed. And when the world noticed, it came for her with knives. The first attack arrived in the form of Edmund Pritchard, appearing at her boarding house on the 4th morning before the Duke's carriage could collect her. "Dr. Hawthorne," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Might I have a word?" Mrs. Patterson hovered in the doorway, her disapproval radiating like heat. Eliza kept her hand on her tool case. "I'm expected elsewhere, Mr. Pritchard. Whatever you need to discuss can wait until I return to the archive." "I don't think it can." Pritchard stepped closer, blocking her path to the street. "You see, there are rather disturbing rumors circulating about your association with the Duke of Norbridge." "My professional association," Eliza corrected coldly. "I'm authenticating manuscripts for His Grace. It's scholarly work, nothing more." "Scholarly work that requires you to spend 8 hours daily in a bachelor's private residence, unchaperoned?" Pritchard's smile was poisonous. "Come now, Dr. Hawthorne. We both know what people will think." "I don't particularly care what people think." "Perhaps you should. Director Wainwright received a letter this morning from Lord Pemberton, a member of the Archive's Board of Trustees. He's quite concerned about the Royal Archives' reputation being tarnished by association with a woman of questionable moral character. The words hit like a physical blow, but Eliza kept her expression neutral. She'd been expecting this. The moment she'd kissed Adrian in his entrance hall, she'd known the consequences would be brutal. "Lord Pemberton can address his concerns to me directly," she said. "Oh, he intends to. There's an emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. They're discussing whether your continued employment is compatible with the archive's mission." Pritchard leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're going to be dismissed, Miss Hawthorne. Not for your scholarship, everyone knows you're brilliant, but for being exactly what women like you always are. Too ambitious, too proud, too willing to compromise your virtue for advancement. Get out of my way." "I'm trying to help you," Pritchard said, though his eyes said otherwise. "If you resign today, quietly, you might salvage some dignity. Continue this farce with the Duke, and you'll be destroyed. No institution will touch you. No publisher will print your work. You'll be remembered as the bluestocking who threw away her career for a nobleman's temporary attention." Eliza looked at him, this mediocre man who'd built his entire career on the accident of his gender, and felt a rage so pure it burned away every other emotion. "You're not trying to help me," she said quietly. "You're trying to eliminate competition, because you know that on merit alone, I'm worth 10 of you. The only advantage you've ever had is being born male in a world that rewards mediocrity in trousers while punishing brilliance in skirts." "How dare you? Psst. No, how dare you?" Eliza's voice cut like glass. "I have spent a decade earning my place through work you couldn't match on your best day. I have translated documents you couldn't read, authenticated manuscripts you couldn't identify, and contributed scholarship you couldn't comprehend. And now you think you can threaten me into silence because I'm making choices you don't approve of? This isn't about approval. It's always about approval with men like you. You need women to fail so your success feels earned instead of handed to you by accident of birth." Pritchard's face went crimson. "The board will ruin you." "Let them try." Eliza pushed past him and climbed into the Duke's carriage, her hands shaking so badly she could barely close the door. The driver looked at her with concern. "Are you well, Dr. Hawthorne?" "Drive," she said. The journey to Norbridge House passed in a blur of fury and fear. Pritchard was right about one thing: the board would move against her. They'd been looking for an excuse to dismiss her for years, and now she'd handed them the perfect one. When she arrived, Blackwood took one look at her face and immediately escorted her to Adrian's study instead of the library. Adrian was at his desk, reviewing correspondence. He looked up as she entered, and his expression shifted immediately from professional to concerned. "What happened?" "The Royal Archive is going to dismiss me," Eliza said bluntly. "There's an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning to discuss my moral character and whether my continued employment damages their reputation." Adrian stood so abruptly his chair scraped across the floor. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I'm spending unchaperoned time in a bachelor's household, that I'm compromising my virtue for professional advancement, that I'm exactly what they've always suspected, an ambitious woman willing to do anything for status. That's absurd. That's reality." Eliza moved to the window, staring out at Mayfair's pristine streets. "I knew this would happen. The moment I allowed myself to want something beyond pure survival, the moment I chose honesty over safety, I knew there would be consequences." "Then we'll fight this," Adrian said. "I'll write to the board. I'll explain that your work is purely professional. You'll make it worse," Eliza interrupted. "A duke defending an unmarried scholar only confirms what they already believe, that I've seduced you, that I'm manipulating you for access to wealth and status. I don't care what they believe. You should, because when they're finished destroying my reputation, they'll start on yours. You think the scandal sheets won't love the story of the Ice Duke corrupted by a scheming bluestocking? You think your position in the House of Lords won't be affected when your colleagues start questioning your judgment?" Adrian crossed the room and turned her to face him. "Listen to me very carefully. I have spent 10 years hiding from the possibility of this exact situation, 10 years choosing safety over honesty because I was afraid of what the world would do if I allowed myself to care about someone again." "Then maybe you were right to hide," Eliza said bitterly. "Maybe honesty is just another word for self-destruction. Or maybe," Adrian said, his voice fierce. Honesty is the only thing worth protecting. Maybe spending a lifetime safe and silent is worse than spending it honest and ruined. Easy for you to say. You're a duke. Even ruined, you'll still have wealth, property, position. I have nothing except my work. If they take that from me, I have nothing. You have me. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning and danger. Eliza stepped back. I can't build my survival on that. I won't be the woman who trades independence for a man's protection, no matter how genuine the offer. I'm not asking you to give up your independence, Adrian said. I'm asking you to let me stand with you instead of forcing you to stand alone. Before Eliza could respond, Blackwood knocked on the study door. Your Grace, forgive the interruption. Mrs. Delacroix is here to see Dr. Hawthorne. Eliza froze. Who? Mrs. Margaret Delacroix, Blackwood said. She claims it's urgent. The name meant nothing to Eliza, but Adrian's expression darkened. Show her in, he said. The woman who entered was perhaps 50, elegantly dressed in deep purple silk, with the kind of sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She looked at Eliza with frank assessment, then turned to Adrian. Your Grace, thank you for receiving me on such short notice. Mrs. Delacroix is the editor of the Westminster Review, Adrian said to Eliza, one of the few publications that actually employs female writers. And publishes their work under their own names, Mrs. Delacroix added. Which is why I'm here, Dr. Hawthorne. I've been following your career with interest for several years. Your work on Eleanor of Aquitaine was exceptional. Thank you, Eliza said warily, but I doubt you came here to discuss medieval scholarship. You're correct. I came to offer you a position. Mrs. Delacroix opened her handbag and withdrew a folded document. The review is expanding its historical research division. We need a senior editor for our medieval studies section. The salary is £60 per year, with additional compensation for published articles. You would have full editorial control and complete autonomy over your research. Eliza stared at her. Why are you offering this to me now? Because I heard about the Royal Archives emergency board meeting. Because I know exactly what they're planning to do to you, and I find it despicable. Mrs. Delacroix's voice hardened. I've watched brilliant women destroyed by institutions that profit from their labor while punishing them for existing. I won't stand by and let it happen again if I can prevent it. You're offering me a position out of pity? I'm offering you a position because you're the best medieval scholar in England, and the review would be privileged to have you. The timing is strategic, not pitying. If the archive dismisses you, you won't spend even a day without professional affiliation. Eliza looked at Adrian, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. This is your decision, he said quietly. Whatever you choose, I support it. The offer was perfect. Better than perfect. £60 was more than she'd ever earned. Editorial control meant no more fighting with mediocre men who resented her expertise. Publication under her own name meant recognition for her work. But accepting felt like surrender, like allowing the Royal Archive to drive her out without consequences. What happens to the women who come after me? Eliza asked. If I leave quietly, if I accept this generous offer and walk away, what message does that send? That women in scholarly positions should expect to be driven out the moment we become inconvenient? Mrs. Delacroix's expression softened with something like approval. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that I attend tomorrow's board meeting, Eliza said. That I make them say to my face exactly why they're dismissing me. That I force them to admit their decision has nothing to do with my scholarship and everything to do with their discomfort with women who refuse to be silent. They'll destroy you publicly, Mrs. Delacroix warned. Then let them try. Let them explain to the academic community why they're dismissing the scholar who authenticated the Aquitaine correspondence while keeping Edmund Pritchard, who hasn't contributed original research in 5 years. This is dangerous, Adrian said. If you confront them directly— I've spent my entire career being careful, Eliza interrupted. Being strategic, making myself small enough to be tolerated. And where has it gotten me? I'm still one scandal away from losing everything. At least if I fight on my own terms. Mrs. Delacroix studied her with open admiration. If you do this, The review will publish a full account of the meeting. We'll make sure the academic community knows exactly what happened. They'll call it biased journalism, Eliza said. Let them. The truth is the truth, regardless of who reports it. Eliza looked between the two people offering her protection, the editor with her job offer, the Duke with his wealth and influence. Both meant well, both wanted to help, but neither could fight this battle for her. I'll attend the meeting, Eliza said. Alone. Eliza, Adrian started. Alone, she repeated firmly. If you come with me, it proves their point, that I need a powerful man's protection, that I can't defend my own work and reputation. You're one person against an entire board of trustees. I've always been one person against entire institutions. This is just more honest about it. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning. Eliza spent the evening preparing her defense the way she'd prepare for an academic presentation, gathering evidence, organizing arguments, building an irrefutable case. Adrian tried to help, but she sent him away. You're too close to this, she said. I need to think clearly. What she didn't say was that having him nearby made her want to accept his protection, made her want to let him solve this problem with money or influence or aristocratic authority. And she couldn't afford that weakness. Not now. She returned to her boarding house late that evening, exhausted and terrified. Mrs. Patterson handed her a stack of letters with even more pronounced disapproval than usual. You've become quite popular, Miss Hawthorne, though I suspect not in the way a decent woman should be. Eliza took the letters without responding and climbed to her room. Most were anonymous attacks, crude insults about her morality, her appearance, her presumption in thinking a duke would seriously consider someone like her. The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded. But the final letter was different, cream-colored paper, red wax seal. She opened it with shaking hands. You asked me once why I chose silence over honesty, Adrian's letter began. I told you it was fear of what the world does to people who speak truthfully. Tomorrow you're going to walk into that board meeting without protection, without allies, with nothing but your voice and your courage. I wish I could be there with you. I wish I could stand beside you and make them understand that their small, frightened judgment means nothing compared to the work you've done. But you're right. This is your battle, your voice, your truth. Well, just know that whatever happens tomorrow, you've already proven something I spent 10 years too afraid to learn, that silence is survival, but honesty is living. I love you, not because you're convenient or safe or because you make my life easier. I love you because you're brilliant and fierce and absolutely unwilling to become smaller for anyone's comfort. Win or lose tomorrow, that truth doesn't change. Yours, Adrian. Eliza read the letter 3 times, then pressed it against her chest and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel afraid. Then she locked the fear away and prepared for war. The Royal Archives boardroom was designed to intimidate, dark wood paneling, portraits of stern men who'd built the institution, a long table where trustees sat in judgment like a tribunal. Eliza had been in this room once before, 3 years ago, when they'd reluctantly approved her employment. She'd been nervous then, desperate to prove herself worthy. She was not nervous now. The board consisted of 7 men: Director Wainwright, Lord Pemberton, Professor Hartford from Cambridge, Sir Edmund Burke, the philanthropist, Dr. James Morrison, the physician, Reverend Thomas Ashford, and Mr. Charles Whitmore, a banker who'd endowed the archive's rare books collection. All of them looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. Dr. Hawthorne, Director Wainwright began, his voice carefully neutral. Thank you for attending this meeting. We felt it important to discuss certain concerns that have been raised about your continued employment. Concerns about my scholarship? Eliza asked, keeping her voice level. Concerns about your conduct, Lord Pemberton interjected. Specifically, reports that you've been spending unchaperoned time in the Duke of Norbridge's private residence. I've been authenticating medieval manuscripts for His Grace. It's professional consultation, nothing more. A professional consultation doesn't require 8-hour daily visits to a bachelor's home, Professor Hartford said. Surely you understand how this appears. It appears that I'm doing the work I was hired to do, providing expert authentication services, which, I should note, several of you have requested for your own private collections over the years. The difference, Reverend Ashford said coldly, is that those consultations were properly chaperoned and appropriate. The difference, Eliza corrected, is that those consultations were with men. When male scholars consult for private collectors, no one questions their morality. But when I do identical work, suddenly it's a scandal. You're being deliberately obtuse, Sir Edmund Burke said. This isn't about your gender. It's about maintaining the archive's reputation for propriety. Then let's discuss propriety, Eliza said. Mr. Pritchard has spent the last 6 months appropriating my research for his own publications without credit. Dr. Morrison's son was caught falsifying authentication documents last year, but you merely reassigned him to a different department. Professor Hartford's protege was discovered selling access to restricted manuscripts, yet he remains employed. Those are internal matters. Those are matters of actual professional misconduct, Eliza interrupted. Yet none of those men faced dismissal. None of them had emergency board meetings called to question their character. The only difference between them and me is that I'm a woman who made powerful men uncomfortable. The room went silent. Lord Pemberton's face had gone crimson. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Point out that this institution has overlooked genuine corruption while punishing women for existing in spaces you think we don't belong. You're out of line, Dr. Hawthorne, Wainwright said. No, I'm finally being honest. Eliza stood, her hands flat on the table. For 3 years I've been careful, strategic. I've made myself small and quiet and unthreatening because I knew that was the only way to survive here. I've accepted half the pay male colleagues receive for the same work. I've allowed men to take credit for my research. I've endured insults and dismissals and constant grinding disrespect because I needed this position. And now, Reverend Ashford asked, now I'm done being grateful for scraps. You want to dismiss me? Fine, do it. But admit the real reason. Admit that my scholarship is exceptional. Admit that I've contributed more to this institution in 3 years than half your permanent staff has contributed in a decade. Admit that you're not firing me for incompetence or impropriety. You're firing me because I refuse to stay silent and small and properly ashamed of my own abilities. This is exactly the kind of arrogance we're concerned about, Professor Hartford said. It's not arrogance when it's true. I am the best medieval manuscript specialist you have. The correspondence I authenticated changed the entire academic understanding of Eleanor of Aquitaine's political influence. The techniques I developed for identifying forgeries have been adopted by institutions across Europe. My translations have been cited in over 40 published papers. She pulled a folder from her case and spread documents across the table. These are letters from scholars at Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, and the British Museum. Every one of them praising my work, requesting my consultation, acknowledging my expertise. External opinions don't change internal policy. No, but they expose your hypocrisy. You benefit from my reputation when it serves you. You cite my work when you need credibility. But the moment I become inconvenient, the moment I refuse to apologize for being brilliant and female simultaneously, you decide I'm a problem. Mr. Whitmore, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Hawthorne? I'm proposing that you admit this dismissal has nothing to do with professional standards and everything to do with enforcing gender-based double standards. Put it in writing. Make it official. Let history record that the Royal Archive dismissed its most accomplished medievalist because she consulted for a duke without a chaperone. You're trying to force us into admitting wrongdoing, Lord Pemberton said. I'm forcing you to be honest about your motivations. If you truly believe I've violated professional standards, document it. Explain exactly which policies I've broken that male scholars haven't broken with impunity. The board members looked at each other uncomfortably. They couldn't document it. They all knew it. Because the truth was exactly what Eliza had said. The only thing she'd done wrong was exist too loudly in a space that wanted her silent. Perhaps, Director Wainwright said carefully, we should table this discussion until we can review Dr. Hawthorne's personnel file more thoroughly. No. Eliza's voice was steel. I want a decision today. Either dismiss me officially and face the public scrutiny of that decision, or acknowledge that this entire meeting was an attempt to intimidate me into resignation. You're being unreasonable. I'm being honest. Something this institution claims to value, but punishes the moment it becomes uncomfortable. Reverend Ashford stood abruptly. I move that we terminate Dr. Hawthorne's employment effective immediately. Her conduct has been inappropriate, her attitude is insubordinate, and her continued presence damages the archive's reputation. I second the motion, Lord Pemberton said quickly. Wainwright looked around the table. All in favor? 4 hands went up. 3 did not. The motion carries, Wainwright said quietly. Dr. Hawthorne, your employment with the Royal Archive is terminated effective today. You have until end of business to collect your personal belongings. Eliza had known this was coming, had prepared for it, but the reality of it still hit like a physical blow. She gathered her documents with steady hands and walked to the door. Then she turned back. History will remember this moment, she said quietly. Not because I'm particularly important, but because this is how institutions die. They stop serving truth and start serving comfort. They punish honesty and reward silence. They destroy their best people to protect their worst. You'll find that history remembers winners, Dr. Hawthorne, Professor Hartford said, not bitter women making dramatic exits. History, Eliza replied, is written by survivors, and I have no intention of disappearing. She walked out of the boardroom with her head high, past the other scholars who'd gathered in the corridor to witness her destruction, past Edmund Pritchard's satisfied smirk, past the shelves of manuscripts she'd spent 3 years protecting. Outside, London's November cold hit her like a slap. She'd done it. She'd fought honestly and lost spectacularly, and somehow, impossibly, she felt more alive than she had in years. A carriage waited at the curb, the Duke's carriage, though she'd told Adrian not to come. The door opened and Adrian himself stepped out, his expression carefully controlled. I told you to stay away, Eliza said. You told me not to attend the meeting. You said nothing about waiting outside. They dismissed me. I know. Blackwood has a contact on the archive staff. I've known for the last 20 minutes. Eliza looked at him, this powerful man who'd learned to be honest because she'd demanded it, and felt something crack in her chest. I lost, she said. No, Adrian replied. You won. You made them say the truth out loud. You forced them to admit their decision was about power, not principle. That's not losing. That's victory. Victory that leaves me unemployed. Victory that leaves you free. He held out his hand. Mrs. Delacroix's offer still stands. The review position is yours if you want it. And if I don't want to be saved by a convenient job offer, then we'll find another solution. But Eliza, he stepped closer, his voice dropping. You don't have to fight every battle alone anymore. You don't have to survive on pure stubbornness. Let someone stand with you. Let me stand with you. Eliza looked at his outstretched hand. She'd spent her entire adult life refusing help because help always came with conditions, with expectations, with the gradual erosion of independence. But maybe Adrian was right. Maybe choosing to trust someone wasn't surrender. Maybe it was just another form of courage. She took his hand. Take me home, she said. Your boarding house? No, Norbridge House. I need to finish authenticating that manuscript. I gave my word, and I keep my promises, even when the rest of the world is falling apart. Adrian smiled, a real smile, the first she'd seen from him. That, he said, is exactly why I love you. They climbed into the carriage together, and as it rolled away from the Royal Archive, Eliza looked back one last time at the institution that had used her brilliance while punishing her existence. She would survive this. She would build something better. And someday, the world would learn that silencing brilliant women only made them more dangerous when they finally found their voice. But first, she had a 13th century manuscript to finish translating. And something told her the monk's final letters would teach her exactly what she needed to know about love, courage, and the terrible price of choosing honesty in a world built on lies. The manuscript waited on the reading desk exactly where Eliza had left it 3 days ago, before her world had collapsed and rebuilt itself into something unrecognizable. She stood in the third-level gallery of Adrian's library, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the leather portfolio. Adrian had retreated to his study to give her space, understanding without being told that she needed solitude for this work. But Blackwood had brought tea and sandwiches, arranging them on a side table with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested he knew exactly what kind of day she'd survived. Eliza ignored the food and focused on the manuscript. She'd authenticated the first 15 letters over the past week, established their provenance, confirmed their age, verified the script. Now only the final 5 remained, and something about them felt different. The handwriting was shakier, more urgent. The Latin was still precise, but the emotion beneath the words had shifted from careful restraint to something raw. She began translating the 16th letter. "I have hidden behind beautiful language for 3 years," the monk wrote. "I have called my silence patience and my fear wisdom. I have convinced myself that writing to you in secret was a form of honesty, when it was simply cowardice dressed in scholarly Latin." Eliza's breath caught. The words could have been Adrian's confession. She continued reading. "You wrote to me last month asking why I never sign my letters, why I continue this correspondence without claiming it. The truth is that I am afraid of what honesty costs. I watched my brother destroyed for loving someone society deemed inappropriate. I watched him lose everything, his position, his reputation, his future, because he chose truth over safety. So I chose silence. I told myself it was protecting you. But silence protects nothing except my own cowardice." The 17th letter was shorter, written in what appeared to be haste. "The abbot discovered my correspondence. He did not read the letters, you kept them safe, as promised, but he knows I have been writing to someone outside the monastery. He has given me a choice: destroy the letters and confess my sin publicly, or leave the order. I thought the decision would be impossible. I have been here for 12 years. This monastery is my home, my identity, my purpose. But when faced with the choice between safety and honesty, between silence and you, the answer was startlingly clear." Eliza set down her magnifying glass and pressed her hands flat against the desk. Her heart was pounding. She picked up the 18th letter. "I am leaving," the monk wrote. "Not because the monastery has cast me out. The abbot would have allowed me to stay if I renounced my attachment. But because I realize now that a life built on silence, no matter how comfortable or safe, is not truly living. I do not know what happens when I reach you. I do not know if you will want the man behind these letters, or if the reality of me will disappoint the image you have constructed from my words. But I know that I cannot spend another year hiding behind anonymous correspondence, pretending that beautiful words written in secret are enough. They are not enough. They were never enough. I am choosing honesty, even if it destroys me." The 19th letter was different from the others, less formal, written in what appeared to be a single sitting without the usual careful composition. "I have been traveling for 6 days. The journey from Yorkshire to your family's estate in Cornwall has given me considerable time to contemplate exactly how foolish this decision is. I am a former monk with no prospects, no fortune, no position in society. You are a merchant's daughter with family expectations and a future that does not include someone like me. Every rational thought tells me to turn back, to return to the monastery and accept the abbot's offer of forgiveness. But I keep thinking about something you wrote in your last letter. Love hidden behind language is still love withheld, and withheld love destroys both people. You were right. Silence has been destroying us both, one beautiful letter at a time." Eliza's hands were shaking now. She reached for the final letter, the 20th and last entry in the manuscript. But this letter was different from the others. It was torn off mid-sentence, the vellum jagged where someone had ripped the page. And the handwriting had changed. The first half was the monk's familiar script, but the continuation, beginning halfway down the page, was written in a different hand, smaller, more angular, distinctly feminine. Eliza's breath stopped. The monk's portion read, "I have reached your father's house. I am standing outside, trying to find the courage to knock on the door, trying to find words adequate to explain why I have traveled 6 days to—" And there the monk's handwriting ended, torn off. The woman's handwriting continued, "To stand in my father's parlor, looking terrified and hopeful in equal measure. I found him on our doorstep holding this unfinished letter, unable to complete the sentence because the reality of me was standing in front of him. He apologized for the incomplete correspondence, said he had spent 3 years writing beautiful letters but had forgotten how to speak honestly in person. So I showed him that honesty does not require perfect words. It simply requires truth. I kissed him. There, in my father's parlor, in front of my scandalized mother and my delighted sister, I kissed a former monk who had traveled halfway across England because he finally learned that silence was not patience, it was cowardice. We are married now. 3 months since he appeared at our door, 6 weeks since my father grudgingly gave his blessing, 1 week since the priest declared us husband and wife. The world thinks we are foolish. My mother's friends whisper that I married beneath my station. His former brothers believe he abandoned his calling for worldly temptation. But we have something they will never understand. We have chosen honesty over safety. We have chosen each other over the easier path of silence and separation. This will be the final entry in our correspondence because we no longer need letters to speak truth. We have each other. We have our voices. We have the courage to say aloud what we once only dared write in secret. For anyone who reads these letters in the future, do not make our mistake. Do not waste years hiding behind beautiful words when honest ones spoken aloud would serve you better. Love demands courage, and courage demands honesty, even when the world punishes you for it. The letter was signed by both of them, the monk's formal Latin signature and the woman's English name written side by side. Eliza sat back in her chair, tears streaming down her face. 700 years ago, someone else had faced the exact same choice: silence or honesty, safety or love, the comfortable lie or the dangerous truth. And they had chosen honesty. They had survived. She heard footsteps on the spiral staircase and wiped her eyes quickly. Adrian appeared, his expression careful. "I heard you stop working. Is something wrong?" "No," Eliza said. "Everything is right. Come read this." He crossed to the desk, and she showed him the final letter, the torn page where two people's handwriting merged, where 7 centuries dissolved, and the past spoke directly to the present. Adrian read in silence, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition to something deeper. "They chose honesty," he said quietly, "and they survived. They built a life together despite everything society said was impossible." Adrian looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the same realization that was crystallizing in her own mind. "We could do the same," he said. "We are doing the same. I just lost my position. You're about to face scrutiny from your peers. The scandal sheets will have a field day with us." "Yes," Adrian agreed. "And in 700 years, maybe someone will find our correspondence and realize we made the same choice these two made, that we chose honesty over safety." Eliza stood and moved to where he was standing. "I need to tell you something, before this goes any further, before we make any permanent decisions. All right. I accepted Mrs. Delacroix's position at the Westminster Review, not because I needed to be saved, but because the work is extraordinary and the opportunity is better than anything the Royal Archive ever offered. I'll be senior editor of their medieval studies section. Full autonomy. My own byline." "That's wonderful. It means I won't be dependent on you financially. I won't be the penniless scholar who married a duke for security. I'll be a professionally employed woman who chose to be with you because I wanted to, not because I needed to." Adrian smiled. "You think I care about that?" "I care about it. I need to know that whatever we build together, it's built on choice, not necessity." "Then I'll tell you something too," Adrian said. "I spoke to my solicitor this morning. I'm establishing a trust fund to support female scholars who've been dismissed or denied positions due to gender discrimination. It will provide research grants, living stipends, and publication support." Eliza stared at him. "Why?" "Because watching you fight alone for 3 years while I wrote anonymous letters was cowardice. Because I have wealth and influence I've never properly used. Because if I can't change the entire system, I can at least ensure other women don't have to choose between their work and their survival. That's going to make you extremely unpopular with your fellow aristocrats." "Good. I've spent 10 years being popular by staying silent. I'd rather be unpopular and useful." Eliza laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from deep relief and unexpected joy. "We're going to be terrible at being proper society members," she said. "I'm counting on it." A knock on the library door interrupted them. Blackwood entered with a silver tray bearing a sealed envelope. This just arrived by special courier, Your Grace. From the Westminster Review. Adrian took the envelope and handed it to Eliza. It's addressed to you. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. It was from Mrs. Delacroix, but the handwriting was urgent, the words abbreviated. Dr. Hawthorne, the Review is publishing a full account of this morning's board meeting in tomorrow's edition. Our legal counsel has reviewed the transcript. We had a stenographer present in the public gallery, perfectly legal, and confirms your assessment. The Royal Archives dismissal was based on gender discrimination, not professional misconduct. We are running the story on page 1 with the headline, Britain's leading medieval scholar dismissed for being female. I thought you should know before it hits the streets. Publication in 6 hours. Yours in solidarity, Margaret Delacroix. Eliza read the letter twice, her heart pounding. They had a stenographer, she said. They recorded everything. What does that mean? Adrian asked. It means my entire confrontation with the board, every accusation I made, every double standard I exposed, will be published tomorrow for all of London to read. Is that good or bad? I don't know. It's either going to vindicate me or destroy what's left of my reputation. But even as she said it, Eliza felt something shifting inside her chest. Fear, yes, but also anticipation. She had spent years being careful, strategic, making herself small enough to be tolerated. Tomorrow, the entire city would see her at full size, and she would face whatever came next without apology. That evening, Eliza returned to her boarding house to pack her belongings. Mrs. Patterson watched with tight-lipped disapproval as she carried boxes down the narrow stairs. I assume you're moving in with your Duke, the landlady said. I'm moving to a flat near the Westminster Review's offices, Eliza corrected. My employer's assisting with the arrangement. Same difference. Ruined women always end up dependent on someone. Eliza set down the box she was carrying and looked Mrs. Patterson directly in the eye. I am not ruined. I am employed, respected by my peers, and about to be published in one of London's most influential journals. The only thing I've lost is the approval of people whose opinions never mattered in the first place. The world won't see it that way. Then the world can learn to see differently. She finished packing and climbed into the carriage Adrian had sent, not to Norbridge House, but to the modest flat Mrs. Delacroix had arranged in Bloomsbury, in a building that housed several of the Review's writers and editors. It was small, just 2 rooms and a kitchenette, but it had excellent light and a desk position near the window. It was hers. That night, Eliza sat at her new desk and did something she had never done before. She wrote an article for publication under her own name, detailing not just her dismissal from the Royal Archive, but the systematic barriers female scholars faced throughout British academic institutions. She wrote about being paid half what male colleagues earned for the same work, about having her research appropriated without credit, about the constant grinding requirement to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. She wrote with all the fury and precision she'd kept locked inside for years. And when she finished, just after midnight, she sealed it in an envelope and walked it to the Westminster Review's offices herself, sliding it under the door with a note. For Mrs. Delacroix, run this alongside tomorrow's story, if you dare. E.H. The next morning, London woke to discover that the scholarly world had a scandal on its hands. The Westminster Review's front page featured 2 articles side by side. Britain's leading medieval scholar dismissed for being female by Margaret Delacroix, complete with transcript excerpts from the board meeting. And below it, What the Royal Archive Doesn't Want You to Know, a scholar's account of institutional discrimination by Dr. Eliza Hawthorne. By noon, every coffeehouse and gentleman's club in London was discussing it. By evening, the scandal had spread to Oxford and Cambridge. By the next morning, Eliza's article had been reprinted in 3 other publications. The response was, as expected, divided and vicious. Conservative publications called her bitter, vindictive, and ungrateful. They suggested she'd fabricated her credentials and manipulated the Duke for advancement. They questioned whether women should be allowed in scholarly positions at all, if this was the kind of chaos that resulted. But other voices rose in unexpected support. Female scholars from across Europe wrote letters to the Review sharing similar experiences. Cambridge professors publicly criticized the Royal Archive's decision. The Geological Society released a statement condemning gender-based dismissals in scientific fields. And most surprisingly, Male scholars began speaking up. Professor Wilhelm Hartmann in Munich published a scathing response to the dismissal, calling it an embarrassment to British scholarship. 3 members of the French Academy of Sciences wrote an open letter demanding an investigation into the Royal Archives' employment practices. Even some British institutions began to shift. The British Museum quietly announced new hiring practices that prohibited gender-based discrimination. Oxford's Medieval Studies Department invited Eliza to deliver a guest lecture. The tide was turning. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough to matter. 1 week after her dismissal, Eliza received an unexpected visitor at the Westminster Review's offices. Director Wainwright from the Royal Archives stood in the doorway, looking significantly less comfortable than he had in the boardroom. "Dr. Hawthorne, might I have a moment?" Eliza looked up from the manuscript she was editing. "You have 2 minutes." Wainwright entered and closed the door behind him. "I want you to know that I argued against your dismissal. I was one of the 3 votes in your favor. How noble of you. You argued quietly while the majority destroyed my career. I could not overrule the board. You could have resigned in protest. You could have made a public statement. You could have done anything except stand by silently while they enacted policies you claimed to oppose." Wainwright flinched. "You're right. I was a coward." "I know." He pulled an envelope from his coat. "The board met again yesterday. Lord Pemberton and Professor Hartford have both resigned following pressure from their respective institutions. The remaining trustees have voted to offer you reinstatement with a formal apology and increased compensation." Eliza took the envelope but didn't open it. "Why?" "Because the academic community has made it clear that the archive's reputation is suffering significantly from this incident. Because we're losing research partnerships and funding opportunities. Because it's become inconvenient to have dismissed me," Eliza finished. "Not because it was wrong, but because it's now bad for business." "Dr. Hawthorne, I understand you're angry." "I'm not angry, Director Wainwright. I'm disappointed. You had a chance to stand for principle when it was difficult and unpopular. You chose not to. Now you're standing for principle when it's safe and advantageous. That's not courage, that's opportunism." She handed the envelope back unopened. "I decline your offer." Wainwright stared at her. "You're refusing reinstatement?" "I'm refusing to return to an institution that only values me when external pressure forces them to. I have a position at the Westminster Review where my work is respected, my expertise is valued, and I don't have to fight for basic dignity every single day. But the archive's resources, the manuscript collection, will still exist, and I'll consult on them when invited, as an external expert at consultant rates, which, I should mention, are considerably higher than what you were paying me as a staff member." Wainwright's expression shifted from hopeful to resigned. "You've thought this through." "I've had a week to consider exactly how much of my life I wasted being grateful for inadequate treatment. I won't make that mistake again." After he left, Eliza sat at her desk, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Powerful. Not because she'd won the Royal Archives' approval, but because she'd discovered she didn't need it. That evening, Adrian arrived at her flat with a bottle of wine and careful optimism. "I heard Wainwright came to see you," he said. "News travels fast. It's London. News travels at the speed of scandal." He poured them both wine. "You turned down the reinstatement." "I did." "Good." Eliza looked at him in surprise. "You think I should have accepted?" "No, I think you should do exactly what makes you happy. And I don't think the Royal Archive makes you happy." "The review does, though. Mrs. Delacroix is brilliant. The other editors are supportive. I'm working on a project comparing medieval women's correspondence across 5 different European collections. It's extraordinary research, and no one is questioning whether I'm qualified to do it. That's what you deserve. That's what you've always deserved." They sat together in her small flat, drinking wine and discussing manuscripts, and Eliza realized something fundamental had changed. She was no longer fighting for the right to exist in spaces that barely tolerated her. She was building spaces that welcomed her completely. A knock on the door interrupted them. Mrs. Chen from the Royal Archives stood in the hallway, looking nervous. "Dr. Hawthorne, forgive the intrusion. I hope you don't mind. Blackwood told me where to find you." "Mrs. Chen, please come in." The elderly manuscript specialist entered, clutching a leather portfolio. I wanted to give you this personally. She handed Eliza the portfolio. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written over the past 3 years. What is this? Eliza asked. Correspondence from scholars around the world requesting your consultation on their research. Letters the Royal Archive received and never forwarded to you. They kept them because acknowledging your expertise to external institutions would have given you leverage to demand better treatment. Eliza's hands trembled as she paged through the letters. Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, the Vatican Archives, all requesting her expertise, all dated months or years ago. They hid these from me, she said quietly. Yes, and I should have given them to you sooner. I was afraid of losing my own position. But after reading your article, after watching you stand up to the board, I realized that staying silent was its own form of betrayal. Mrs. Chen pulled out another document. This is a list of every female scholar who's been dismissed from the Royal Archive in the past 20 years. 7 women, all brilliant, all destroyed for reasons that had nothing to do with their work. Why are you showing me this? Because you have a platform now. Because the Westminster Review will publish truth that the archive would have buried. Because these women deserve to have their stories told. Eliza looked at the list. 7 names, 7 careers destroyed, 7 brilliant minds the world had lost. I'll tell their stories, she said. All of them. Mrs. Chen smiled. I thought you might. That's why I also brought this. She handed Eliza one final letter. It was from Caroline Ashford, Adrian's former fiancée, written 3 weeks before her death. How did you get this? Eliza asked. It was in the archive's collection of donated correspondence. Her family gave their papers to us years ago. I thought the Duke might want to know that she didn't blame him, that she understood why he couldn't save her. Eliza looked at Adrian, who had gone very pale. Do you want to read it? She asked gently. He nodded, unable to speak. The letter was brief, written in shaking handwriting. Adrian, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Please know that I never blamed you for what happened. You were young, and we were both trapped in a system designed to destroy anyone who dared to be honest. I am writing this not to burden you with guilt, but to free you from it. My death is not your fault. It is the fault of a world that punishes women for having thoughts worth writing down. If you ever meet someone who makes you want to be brave again, don't let fear stop you. Don't let my tragedy become an excuse for your silence. Choose honesty. Choose love. Choose the difficult, dangerous path of being truthful in a world built on comfortable lies. That would be the best memorial you could give me. Live the life I didn't get to live. With love and hope, Caroline. Adrian's hands were shaking as he set down the letter. She wanted me to choose honesty, he said. 10 years ago, she was telling me the same thing you've been telling me. And you finally listened, Eliza said gently. It took me long enough. Better late than never. That night, after Mrs. Chen left and Adrian finally returned to Norbridge House, Eliza sat at her desk and began writing a new article. Not about her own dismissal, but about the 7 women who'd come before her. 7 brilliant scholars whose names had been erased from academic history because they dared to be intelligent and female simultaneously. She would tell their stories. She would make sure the world knew what had been lost. And she would make absolutely certain that the next generation of female scholars had an easier path than she had. The article took her 3 days to write and was published the following week under the headline, The Women British Scholarship Tried to Erase. The response was immediate and explosive. Universities across Europe began investigating their own employment practices. Female scholars who'd been working in obscurity suddenly had their contributions acknowledged. The conversation about gender discrimination in academic fields became impossible to ignore. And Eliza Hawthorne, the unmarried scholar who'd been dismissed for being too difficult, became the voice of a movement she'd never intended to lead. But she led it anyway, because silence had never been an option for her, and honesty, no matter how dangerous, was the only way she knew how to live. 3 weeks after her dismissal, Adrian proposed, not with elaborate romance or public spectacle, but quietly, in her small flat, while they were arguing about the correct translation of a particularly difficult Latin passage. "Marry me," he said, interrupting her mid-sentence. Eliza looked up from the manuscript. What? Marry me. Not because you need my protection or my money or my status, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life arguing with you about medieval Latin and watching you change the world. That's possibly the least romantic proposal in history. I know, but it's honest. Eliza set down her magnifying glass and looked at him. Really looked at him. This man who'd learned to be brave because she'd demanded it, who'd chosen honesty even when it cost him comfort, who'd stood by her when the world tried to destroy her. Yes, she said, on one condition. Anything. I keep my name. Professionally, I remain Dr. Eliza Hawthorne. I won't become the Duchess of Norbridge, who used to be a scholar. I'll be Dr. Hawthorne, who happens to also be a duchess. Done. And I continue working at the Review. I won't give up my career to be a society ornament. I would never ask you to. And when we have children, if we have children, they'll be raised to understand that intelligence and courage aren't gendered traits, that women are just as capable of brilliance as men. Obviously, Eliza smiled. Then yes, I'll marry you. They were married 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony that scandalized Adrian's aristocratic relatives and delighted the Westminster Review's editorial staff. The scandal sheets had a field day. Conservative publications called it a tragedy, a duke corrupted by an ambitious woman. Progressive publications called it a victory, proof that love could transcend class and gender barriers. Eliza didn't care what any of them called it. She had made her choice. Honesty over safety, love over silence. The difficult, dangerous path of being completely herself in a world that wanted her smaller. And for the first time in her life, she felt absolutely, gloriously free. The freedom lasted approximately 12 hours before the consequences arrived in force. The morning after her wedding, Eliza woke in Norbridge House, now legally her home, to discover that 3 major London newspapers had published editorials condemning her marriage as evidence of moral decay in British society. The Times called it an unfortunate union between aristocratic weakness and feminine ambition. The Morning Post suggested Adrian had been ensnared by a calculating woman who used intellectual pretensions to secure wealth and status. The Gentleman's Review went further, publishing a full-page cartoon depicting Eliza as a serpent coiled around a helpless duke, with the caption, "When blue stockings bite." Eliza read them all over breakfast while Adrian paced the dining room like a caged animal. "I'm going to sue them," he said. "Every single publication. Libel. Defamation." "You'll do no such thing," Eliza interrupted calmly, spreading marmalade on her toast. "Lawsuits only give them more material. Besides, I've survived worse than cartoons. You shouldn't have to survive this at all." "No, I shouldn't. But the world is what it is, not what it should be. We work with reality, not ideals." Adrian stopped pacing and looked at her. "How are you so calm?" "Because I've spent years being attacked for existing. This is just a louder version of what's always been happening." Eliza took a bite of toast, considering. "Although I will admit the serpent cartoon is creative. I might frame it." "You're joking." "I'm adapting. There's a difference." What Eliza didn't tell Adrian was that the attacks stung more than she wanted to admit. Not because she believed them, but because they proved how thoroughly the world would work to diminish women who refused to be small. She had earned a doctorate, published groundbreaking research, stood up to institutional corruption, and still the narrative reduced her to a scheming temptress who trapped a naive nobleman. But she had also learned something crucial over the past month. She was no longer fighting alone. That afternoon, the Westminster Review published a response to the attacks. Mrs. Delacroix's editorial was titled, "When Truth Threatens Comfort, Why London's Press Fears Dr. Hawthorne." It was a surgical dismantling of every accusation, backed by documentation of Eliza's academic credentials, lists of her published works, testimonials from European scholars, and a pointed comparison of her qualifications against the male editors who'd attacked her. The final paragraph read, "The press calls Dr. Hawthorne ambitious as if ambition in women is a crime. But ambition paired with brilliance is exactly what Britain's academic institutions need. If that threatens comfortable men who've never had to earn their positions, perhaps the problem is not Dr. Hawthorne's ambition, but their mediocrity." Within hours, other publications picked up the story. Female writers across London began publishing their own responses. Oxford's first female mathematics student wrote an open letter in support. A group of suffragettes adopted Eliza as a symbol of women's intellectual resistance. The narrative was shifting, not everywhere, not completely, but enough that by the end of the week the conversation had changed from "Did the Duke make a mistake?" to "Why is British society so threatened by educated women?" Eliza watched it happen with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. She had never wanted to be a symbol or a movement leader. She had simply wanted to do her work in peace, but peace, apparently, was not an option for women who refused to disappear. 2 weeks after the wedding, Eliza received an unexpected letter from Oxford University. The Medieval Studies Department was offering her a position as visiting lecturer for the spring term, the first time Oxford had ever extended such an offer to a woman. She read the letter 3 times before showing it to Adrian. "This is extraordinary," he said. Oxford never hires women," Eliza finished, "which means this is either a genuine breakthrough or a calculated move to appear progressive without making permanent changes. Does it matter which? It matters because if I accept and fail, I set the cause back decades. If I accept and succeed, they'll use me as evidence that they've solved the women problem while continuing to exclude everyone else." Adrian sat down across from her. "What do you want to do?" "I want to refuse on principle. I want to tell them they had their chance to employ me years ago when I earned my doctorate from their institution, and they chose not to. I want to make them face their hypocrisy." But refusing means the door closes for other women. Accepting means I have to be perfect. Flawless scholarship, impeccable conduct, no mistakes allowed, because I won't just be representing myself. I'll be representing every woman who comes after me. That's an impossible burden. Yes, but it's the burden anyway. Eliza accepted the position 3 days later with one condition. Oxford had to commit to interviewing at least 3 female candidates for permanent faculty positions within the next 2 years. The university agreed, though she suspected they never expected her to hold them to it. She would. The spring term at Oxford was exactly as difficult as she'd anticipated. Male students attended her lectures looking for evidence of female incompetence. Senior professors sat in the back of her classroom, watching for mistakes. Every interpretation she offered was challenged, every conclusion questioned. But Eliza had spent her entire career being tested in ways male colleagues never experienced. She was ready. Her first lecture was on Eleanor of Aquitaine's political correspondence, the exact research that had nearly gotten her blacklisted 3 years earlier. She presented the evidence methodically, building an irrefutable case that Eleanor had been far more politically influential than traditional histories acknowledged. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Professor Edmund Halifax, the same man who'd tried to block publication of her original paper, stood from his seat in the back. "Dr. Hawthorne," he said, his voice carrying across the lecture hall, "I owe you an apology." Every head in the room turned. 3 years ago, I called your work on the Aquitaine correspondence ambitious overreach," Halifax continued. "I used my influence to delay publication. I questioned your methods and your conclusions because they contradicted my own research." He paused, and Eliza could see the effort it cost him to continue. "I was wrong. Your analysis was superior to mine in every way. I allowed ego and territoriality to override scholarly integrity, and I did significant damage to your career in the process." The silence in the room was absolute. "I cannot undo that damage," Halifax said, "but I can publicly acknowledge your expertise and encourage my colleagues to evaluate your work on its merits rather than your gender, which, I'm ashamed to say, I failed to do." Eliza stood very still, processing the moment. This man had tried to destroy her career, had used his position and influence to undermine her work, had been one of the primary reasons she'd struggled to find employment, and now he was apologizing, publicly, in front of students and colleagues. "Thank you, Professor Halifax," she said carefully. "I appreciate your honesty." After the lecture, Halifax approached her privately. "I know that apology doesn't fix anything," he said, "but I wanted you to know your work changed how I think about medieval women's history, forced me to confront my own biases. It's been an uncomfortable education, but a necessary one." "What changed your mind?" Eliza asked. "Reading your Westminster Review articles, seeing how the Royal Archive treated you, recognizing the same patterns in my own behavior. Halifax looked at her directly. I spent 30 years believing I was defending academic standards. Turns out I was defending my own comfort and calling it principle. That takes courage to admit. It takes basic decency, which I should have had years ago. Better late than never, I suppose. After he left, Eliza sat in the empty lecture hall, processing what had just happened. One apology didn't erase years of discrimination. One professor's change of heart didn't fix a broken system, but it was something, a crack in the wall, a sign that change was possible, even if it came slowly and painfully. By the end of the spring term, Eliza's lectures were the most attended in Oxford's Medieval Studies department. Students, both male and female, sought her expertise. Other professors began citing her work without the usual caveats about gender. And when the term concluded, Oxford made an unprecedented announcement. They were creating a permanent position for a female lecturer in medieval studies. The position would be open to qualified candidates beginning next academic year. It wasn't everything, but it was progress. Eliza returned to London that summer to find that the Westminster Review had been nominated for a journalism award for their coverage of gender discrimination in academic institutions. Her own article series on erased female scholars had been compiled into a book, with proceeds going to the scholarship fund Adrian had established. And most surprisingly, the Royal Archive had undergone significant reforms. Under pressure from academic institutions across Europe, they'd revised their employment policies, hired 3 female researchers to permanent positions, and publicly acknowledged their past discrimination. Edmund Pritchard had been quietly dismissed for research misconduct. Apparently, the Italian manuscripts he'd found in his personal collection had actually been stolen from the archive's restricted vault. Eliza read about his dismissal in the newspaper and felt nothing but tired satisfaction. Pritchard had built his career on mediocrity, protected by gender privilege. The moment that protection was removed, his incompetence became impossible to ignore. That evening, she and Adrian sat in the library at Norbridge House, the same room where they'd first worked together, where she'd discovered his handwriting in the anonymous letters, where everything had begun. "Do you ever regret it?" Adrian asked, choosing honesty over safety, fighting instead of hiding. Eliza considered the question seriously. "I regret that fighting was necessary. I regret living in a world where being intelligent and female requires constant battle. But do I regret the choices I made? No." "Even knowing what it cost you?" "Especially knowing what it cost. Because the alternative, staying silent, making myself small, accepting inadequate treatment, that would have destroyed me in a different way. At least this way I'm being destroyed for being too much myself rather than too little." "You're not being destroyed," Adrian said. "You're thriving." "I'm surviving very loudly. There's a difference." He smiled and pulled out a letter from his desk drawer. "This arrived today, from the Vatican Archives. They're requesting your consultation on a collection of medieval women's correspondence they're considering for publication." Eliza took the letter, her hands trembling slightly. The Vatican Archives, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. "They want me to authenticate and translate a full collection," she said, reading. 6 months' work, based in Rome. "Are you going to accept? Are you going to come with me?" Adrian laughed. "I married you specifically to have adventures that terrify my aristocratic relatives. Rome sounds perfect." They left for Italy that autumn, and Eliza spent 6 months doing exactly what she'd always dreamed of, working with rare manuscripts in one of the world's greatest archives, with full resources and complete respect for her expertise. The Vatican scholars treated her as an equal. Her gender was noted, certainly, but it didn't define how they evaluated her work. When she corrected a senior archivist's translation error, he thanked her instead of resenting her. It was, she realized, what academic life should have always been. When they returned to London the following spring, Eliza was 7 months pregnant and finished with making herself palatable to institutions that would never fully accept her. "I'm resigning from Oxford," she told Mrs. Delacroix over tea, "and from the Review." Mrs. Delacroix's eyebrows rose. "May I ask why?" "Because I'm tired of fighting for space in other people's institutions. I want to build something new." "What kind of something?" Eliza pulled out a detailed proposal she'd been working on during her pregnancy. "An independent research institute for female scholars. a place where women can work without constantly justifying their existence, with proper funding, resources, publication support, and none of the institutional barriers that have kept us marginalized. That's ambitious. I'm told ambition is one of my character flaws. Mrs. Delacroix read through the proposal, her expression shifting from curiosity to excitement. This is brilliant. How are you funding it? Adrian is providing initial capital, but I'm also approaching female philanthropists, progressive universities, and institutions that have benefited from women's scholarship without properly compensating them. If they want to prove they support female academics, they can put money behind that support. When do you launch? Next year, after I've recovered from childbirth and figured out how to be a mother and a scholar simultaneously, which, I'm told, is also impossible. Everything you've done was supposedly impossible. Exactly. So this should be relatively straightforward. Eliza's daughter was born that summer, in the middle of a thunderstorm that seemed appropriate for a child whose parents had built their relationship on choosing honesty over safety. They named her Caroline, after Adrian's first fiancée, the woman whose death had taught him about the cost of silence, whose final letter had given him permission to choose courage. Little Caroline came into the world screaming with indignation, and Eliza laughed through the pain because she understood that rage. The fury of existing in a world that didn't want you, that made your very presence a radical act. She's going to be trouble, the midwife said, handing over the tiny, furious infant. Good, Eliza replied. The world needs more trouble. 6 months later, the Hawthorne Institute for Medieval Studies opened its doors in a renovated building in Bloomsbury. It was small, just 5 research fellows to start, all women who'd been excluded from traditional academic positions despite exceptional qualifications. The Institute's mission was simple: provide female scholars with resources, support, and freedom to pursue research without institutional barriers. No fighting for basic respect, no justifying their right to exist, just work. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Applications poured in from across Europe. Women who'd been working in isolation, denied positions, excluded from publications. Women with brilliant ideas and nowhere to pursue them. Within 2 years, the Institute had expanded to 15 fellows. Within 5, they'd published more groundbreaking medieval research than most traditional universities. And the best part? Traditional institutions started to pay attention. When the Hawthorne Institute's fellows produced exceptional scholarship, Oxford and Cambridge couldn't ignore it. When their translations and authentications became the gold standard in the field, other institutions had to acknowledge their expertise. Slowly, painfully, the academic world began to change. Not because powerful men suddenly became enlightened, but because women like Eliza built alternatives that were too successful to dismiss. 10 years after her dismissal from the Royal Archive, Eliza stood in the Institute's library, watching her research fellows work. Young women bent over manuscripts, arguing about interpretations, challenging each other's conclusions without fear of being called too aggressive or unwomanly. It looked like freedom. Adrian found her there, their daughter Caroline perched on his shoulders. At 8 years old, Caroline was already showing signs of her mother's intellectual ferocity and her father's quiet determination. "Mama, Papa says you used to hide from mean men who didn't like smart women," Caroline announced. "Is that true?" Eliza exchanged a look with Adrian, who shrugged apologetically. "Not exactly," Eliza said. "I never hid, but I did spend years fighting for the right to work without being punished for it." "That's stupid," Caroline declared. "Why would anyone punish you for being smart?" "Because some people are threatened by intelligence they don't possess. Because the world was built by people who wanted to keep power for themselves. Because change is frightening to those who benefit from things staying the same." "But you won, right? You made them change." Eliza knelt down to her daughter's level. "I didn't win alone. Lots of people fought. Some won small victories, some lost battles, some are still fighting. But yes, things are better now than they were." "Are they good enough?" "No, but they're better. And better is how progress happens. One uncomfortable conversation, one small victory, one brave choice at a time." Caroline considered this with the seriousness of a child who'd inherited her parents' tendency toward thoughtful analysis. "When I grow up, I'm going to be a scholar like you," she said. And I won't have to fight mean men because you already did. You'll fight different battles, Eliza said gently. The world keeps creating new ways to limit people. But you'll have tools I didn't have, support I didn't have, and knowledge that women before you fought so you could exist more easily. Will you teach me how to fight? I'll teach you how to think, how to speak truth without apology, how to build instead of just resisting. The rest you'll figure out yourself. That evening, after Caroline was asleep, Eliza and Adrian sat in the library at Norbridge House. The room had become their refuge over the years, a place where they could work side by side in comfortable silence, where ancient manuscripts mingled with modern research, where the past and present lived together peacefully. Adrian was reading through applications for the Institute's newest fellowship position. Eliza was translating a particularly stubborn 13th century letter. "Listen to this one," Adrian said. 24 years old, doctorate from Berlin, published 3 papers on Byzantine manuscript traditions, currently working as a governess because no university will hire her. Hire her immediately. I thought you'd say that. There's something else, though. He passed her the application. Read the personal statement. Eliza scanned the page and felt her breath catch. I have spent years hiding my research, publishing under male pseudonyms, pretending my ideas came from the men who employed me, the applicant had written. When I read about Dr. Hawthorne's work, both her scholarship and her refusal to be silent, I realized I had a choice. Continue hiding or fight for the right to exist openly. This application is my choice. I'm choosing honesty, even if it costs me everything. Eliza set down the letter, her eyes burning. She's choosing what we chose, Adrian said quietly. Yes, because we proved it was possible to survive it. More than survive. Look at what you've built. Eliza looked around the library, at the shelves filled with research from the Institute's fellows, at the framed letters from scholars whose careers they'd supported, at the small portrait of Caroline that hung above the fireplace. We built it, she corrected. You could have stayed silent, protected your position and comfort. Instead, you chose to stand with me, fund the Institute, use your influence to open doors. I chose honesty, Adrian said. Same as you, just took me longer to find the courage. There was a long, comfortable silence, the kind of silence they'd learned to share over years of partnership. Not the silence of things unsaid, but the peace of understanding that didn't require words. Finally, Eliza spoke. Do you remember the monk's final letter, the one where he wrote that love demands courage and courage demands honesty? I remember. I used to think he was talking about romantic love, the courage to choose a relationship over safety. And now? Now I think he was talking about something bigger, the courage to love your work enough to fight for it, the courage to love yourself enough to refuse to be smaller, the courage to love the world enough to demand it be better, even when that demand costs you everything. Adrian moved to sit beside her, taking her hand. Do you regret any of it? The fights, the sacrifices, the years of battle? Eliza thought about the question honestly. She thought about the Royal Archive, the dismissal, the public attacks. She thought about the exhaustion of constantly fighting, the cost of being a symbol when she'd only wanted to be a scholar. But she also thought about the Institute, the women whose careers she'd helped save, the small but meaningful changes in how academic institutions treated female scholars. I regret that the fight was necessary, she said. I regret every woman who came before me who didn't have the resources or support to survive what I survived. I regret that Caroline will face different but equally real barriers. But the choices you made? The choices I made gave me a life I can be proud of, work that matters, relationships built on honesty, a daughter who will never doubt that her intelligence is an asset, not a liability. She squeezed his hand. We chose truth over comfort. And truth, it turns out, is worth the cost. 15 years after her dismissal from the Royal Archive, Eliza received a letter from Oxford University. They were establishing a permanent chair in medieval women's studies, the first of its kind in British academic history. And they wanted to offer her the position. She read the letter twice, then showed it to Adrian without comment. Are you going to accept? He asked. I don't know. The Institute is thriving. Caroline is settled in her schooling. I have more research projects than I can manage. Those are all practical reasons. What do you want to do? Eliza looked at the letter again. The position came with full resources, graduate students, publication support, and the explicit mission of training the next generation of female medieval scholars. It was everything she'd fought for, offered by an institution that had excluded her for years. I want to accept, she said slowly, not because I need Oxford's validation, but because having a woman in that position will make it easier for the women who come after me. Then accept. It means dividing my time between Oxford and London, restructuring the institute, changing everything we've built. We've changed everything before. We can do it again. Eliza accepted the position 3 days later, with the same condition she'd demanded years earlier. Oxford had to commit to hiring and promoting female faculty across all departments, not just medieval studies. They agreed, and this time she made sure they put it in writing. The years that followed were a blur of lectures, research, publication, and the constant grinding work of changing institutions from within. Eliza trained a generation of female scholars who would never have to fight the battles she'd fought, or at least not the same ones. She published 5 books, established 3 permanent fellowships for women at major universities, and served on advisory boards that reshaped how British institutions approached gender equity in academic fields. And through it all, she remained Dr. Eliza Hawthorne, never just the Duchess, never just Adrian's wife, but always herself, completely and unapologetically. On the 30th anniversary of her dismissal from the Royal Archive, the institution held a public ceremony acknowledging their past discrimination and formally apologizing for their treatment of female scholars. They invited Eliza to speak. She almost declined. The Royal Archive's apology felt 30 years too late, offered only after enough pressure made maintaining their past position untenable. But she accepted because young female scholars deserved to see that institutions could change, that their voices mattered, that persistence could eventually force acknowledgement. The ceremony was held in the same library where she'd spent 3 years fighting for basic respect. The room was full of scholars, students, journalists, and the current director, a woman, coincidentally, who'd been one of Eliza's first research fellows at the Institute. Eliza stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, and felt the weight of 3 decades of history pressing down on her shoulders. 30 years ago, she began, this institution dismissed me for the crime of being intelligent while female. They claimed it was about propriety, about professional standards, about maintaining reputation. But we all knew the truth. It was about maintaining power structures that served mediocre men at the expense of brilliant women. The room was silent. Today, the Royal Archive apologizes. They acknowledge their discrimination. They promise to do better. She paused, letting the moment breathe. I accept their apology, but I want to be clear about something. This apology doesn't erase the damage done. It doesn't restore the careers they destroyed before mine. It doesn't undo the decades of work performed by women who were never credited, never compensated, never acknowledged. What this apology does, what it can do, is mark a turning point, a public admission that the old ways were wrong, a commitment to building something better. Eliza looked directly at the young female scholars in the audience. To the women in this room who are just beginning their careers, you will still face barriers. You will still encounter men who resent your intelligence, institutions that undervalue your work, systems designed to exclude you. But you have something I didn't have. You have proof that change is possible. You have a network of women who fought these battles before you. You have institutions, imperfect, still evolving, but improving, that are beginning to recognize that excluding half of humanity's intellectual potential is not just unethical, it's stupid. Fight when you need to fight, but also build, create alternatives, support each other, and never, ever make yourself smaller to fit into spaces that were never designed for you. Build bigger spaces instead. The applause started slowly, then built into something overwhelming. Eliza stood at the podium, watching the next generation of female scholars stand and cheer, and felt something shift in her chest. This was what victory looked like. Not perfect, not complete, but real. After the ceremony, Eliza walked through the Royal Archive's manuscript preservation room one final time, the room where she'd spent countless hours translating voices from the past, fighting for the right to exist in the present. It looked exactly the same. Same shelves, same careful organization, same smell of old paper and preservation chemicals. But everything had changed. She found Adrian waiting outside, their daughter Caroline beside him. At 23, Caroline had just completed her own doctorate in medieval literature and was about to begin a position at Cambridge, a position offered without question, without barriers, without the battles Eliza had fought. "How do you feel?" Caroline asked. "Tired," Eliza admitted. "Satisfied, ready to focus on work instead of fighting." "You've been saying that for 30 years. "Yes, but this time I mean it." They walked together through London's spring afternoon, 3 generations of choosing honesty over safety, courage over comfort. "Mama," Caroline said suddenly, "I've been offered a research position in Paris. Full funding, excellent resources, collaboration with the Sorbonne's medieval department. That's wonderful. It means leaving England, being away from the Institute, from you and Papa." Eliza stopped walking and looked at her daughter. "Are you asking permission or telling me?" "Telling you. But I wanted you to know." "Then go. Build your own path, fight your own battles, make your own choices." "Were you afraid when you made your choices?" Caroline asked. "When you confronted the Royal Archive, when you started the Institute, when you chose honesty even though it cost you everything?" Eliza thought about the question honestly. "I was terrified," she said. "Every single time. Fear doesn't go away just because you're brave. But I learned that being afraid and choosing courage anyway is the only kind of bravery that actually matters." "Did it get easier?" "No. But I got stronger, and I learned to recognize which fears were worth listening to and which ones were just the world trying to keep me small." Caroline hugged her mother tightly. "Thank you. For fighting so I could walk through doors you had to break down. Thank you for walking through them. That's what makes the fighting worth it." That evening, Eliza and Adrian returned to Norbridge House for the last time before Caroline left for Paris. The library was full of manuscript boxes, research Caroline was taking with her, Eliza's own ongoing projects, Adrian's correspondence with the scholarship fund. 30 years of accumulated work, of choosing honesty, of building something that mattered. Adrian found Eliza standing in front of the manuscript cabinet where they'd first examined the monk's letters, the correspondence that had started everything. "Do you ever reread them?" he asked. "The monk's letters?" "Sometimes. When I need to remember why we chose this path." "What do they tell you now that they didn't tell you then?" Eliza considered the question. "Then I thought they were about choosing love over duty, about having the courage to speak instead of hide. And now? Now I think they're about choosing to live authentically in a world that punishes authenticity, about understanding that beautiful words written in secret are still a form of dying, and that only honesty, loud, uncomfortable, dangerous honesty, is actually living." She turned to face Adrian. "We chose to live, even when the world told us to be quiet, even when it cost us everything. We chose to exist fully and loudly and without apology. Do you regret it?" Eliza looked around the library, at the work they'd built together, the battles they'd fought, the changes they'd helped create. "Not for a single moment," she said. Years later, when Eliza was in her 70s and had officially retired from teaching but not from research, she received one final letter that changed how she understood her entire life. It came from a young woman in India who'd read Eliza's work and had been inspired to pursue medieval studies despite her family's objections and her society's barriers. "Your story taught me that surviving is not enough," the young woman wrote. "That we owe it to ourselves and to each other to fight for the right to exist completely. You will never meet me, will never know my name, but you changed my life by refusing to disappear." Eliza read the letter sitting in the library at Norbridge House, in the same chair where she'd first translated the monk's correspondence 40 years earlier. She thought about that monk who'd chosen honesty, about Caroline Ashford, who'd died for speaking truth, about all the women whose names had been erased from history because they dared to be brilliant. And she thought about the young woman in India, fighting battles Eliza would never see, in places she would never visit, carrying forward the same struggle for the right to exist authentically. The work was never finished. The fight was never over. But it continued. And that continuation was its own form of victory. Eliza took out a piece of cream-colored paper. She still used the same stationery Adrian had used for his anonymous letters all those years ago and began to write. Dear scholar, you are right. Surviving is not enough. We owe it to ourselves and each other to live fully, to speak honestly, to refuse to become smaller than we are. The battles you fight will be different from mine, but the courage required is the same. The world will try to silence you in new ways, using different words, but with the same intention, to keep you manageable, quiet, controllable. Do not be managed. Do not be quiet. Do not be controlled. Build what you need to build. Say what you need to say. Fight what you need to fight. And know that somewhere, across time and distance, women you'll never meet are fighting beside you. We are never as alone as the world wants us to believe. With solidarity and hope. Dr. Eliza Hawthorne. She sealed the letter and sent it, knowing she would likely never receive a response, knowing it didn't matter. The work continued, the courage continued, the honesty continued, and that was enough. On her 80th birthday, Eliza stood in the library at Norbridge House, surrounded by 3 generations of women scholars. Her daughter Caroline, now a renowned professor herself, Caroline's daughter Eleanor, working on her doctorate, and a dozen fellows from the institute that still bore Eliza's name. Adrian, now in his mid-80s but still sharp as ever, raised a glass of wine. To my wife, he said, who taught me that love requires courage, courage requires honesty, and honesty is the only way to live. To Eliza, the room echoed. Eliza looked around at the faces, young and old, from different countries and backgrounds, united by the same stubborn refusal to be silenced. No, she said, to all of us. To every woman who chose truth over safety. To everyone who fought so the next generation could fight less. To the work that continues long after we're gone. She raised her own glass. To living honestly in a world built on comfortable lies. To building better spaces instead of begging for entry to broken ones. To choosing courage every single day, even when, especially when, it costs us everything. To courage, the room replied. And in that moment, surrounded by the work she'd built and the women who would carry it forward, Eliza understood something fundamental. Victory was never about proving the world wrong. It was about refusing to let the world make you small. It was about choosing honesty when silence would be safer, building when destruction would be easier, fighting when surrender would be more comfortable. It was about looking at impossible odds and saying, I will exist anyway. She had spent her entire life fighting for that right. And now, at 80, she could finally say with certainty, it had been worth every battle. Months later, Eliza sat in the library working on one final translation. The manuscript was a collection of letters from a 14th century female scholar who'd disguised her work under a male pseudonym, her true identity only recently discovered. As Eliza translated, she felt the centuries dissolve. This woman, writing 600 years ago, had faced the same battles, the same silencing, the same requirement to hide her brilliance or face destruction. But she had written anyway, and now, 6 centuries later, her words would finally be published under her real name. Eliza finished the translation just as the evening light faded. She set down her pen and looked out at London, this city that had tried to destroy her and that she had helped change, however slightly. Adrian found her there, watching the sunset. Finished? He asked. Yes, this scholar, her name was Marjorie of Kent. She was extraordinary. Her analysis of Aristotelian logic rivals anything produced by male scholars of her era, but she had to publish under her brother's name to be taken seriously. Will you include that in your introduction? I'll include everything. Her brilliance, the barriers she faced, the courage it took to write it all, when the world wanted her silent. She would have liked you, I think. Eliza smiled. She would have understood me. That's better than being liked. They sat together in the fading light, 2 people who'd chosen honesty over safety and built a life worth living in the space that choice had opened. Do you remember, Eliza said quietly, the first time you signed your name to a letter, instead of hiding behind anonymity? I remember being terrified. And now? Now I can't imagine living any other way. Eliza took his hand. Neither can I. They sat together as darkness fell and the stars emerged, Those same stars that had watched centuries of scholars fight for the right to exist, that would watch centuries more continue the same battle. The work was never finished. But it was being done. And that truth, that simple, powerful truth, was the most honest thing Eliza had ever known. Somewhere in the darkened library, cream-colored paper waited for tomorrow's work. Manuscripts needed translation, stories needed telling, voices long silenced needed to be heard. Eliza Hawthorne, scholar and survivor, troublemaker and truth-teller, would be there in the morning, ready to fight, ready to build, ready to live honestly for one more day, because that was what courage looked like. Not perfection, not victory, not even success. Just the stubborn daily choice to exist fully in a world that demanded she be less. And that choice, repeated across decades, across generations, across centuries of women refusing to disappear, that choice changed everything.